Deep within the lungs of the world, where the canopy of the Amazon rainforest weaves a ceiling of eternal emerald, there lies a legend that refuses to die. It is a place where the streets are paved with ingots of pure gold, where temples of sun-baked amber reflect the stars, and where a king is dusted in gold dust every morning, only to wash it away in a sacred lake come nightfall. For 500 years men have marched into the green abyss to find it. Most never returned. This is the story of the City of Gold. Welcome. If you are using this story to help you fall asleep tonight, that is perfect. Just let your shoulders drop, unclench your jaw, and let the history I am about to tell you paint a picture in your mind until you drift off. Before we begin the journey, please take a second to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. And I have a question for you. Tell me in the comments what time it is and where in the world you are listening from. I love hearing all the different places and times. It reminds me that even though we are apart, we are all in this together, sharing this moment of rest. Now, let us turn back the clock to a time before maps, to the high Andes. To understand the story of El Dorado, we must first close our eyes to the world as we know it, the world of concrete, steel, and precise coordinates, and open them instead to a world of vapour and imagination. We must step into the mind of a 16th century explorer, a mind that is tired, feverish, and desperate for wonder. For the City of Gold was not originally a place found on any parchment or navigational chart. It was a place that existed in the collective dream of a generation. It was called Manoa. In the whispers of the time, Manoa was not merely a wealthy settlement, it was a metropolis of impossible radiance. Imagine, if you will, the jungle parting like a heavy velvet curtain. Behind the wall of tangled vines and ancient kapok trees, the humidity suddenly breaks. The air becomes sweet, carrying not the scent of decaying leaves and wet earth, but the fragrance of crushed cinnamon bark, wild vanilla, and the resin of burning copal. There, resting on the shores of a vast mirror-like lake known as Lake Parim, stands the city. In this dream, the architecture defies gravity and logic. The descriptions passed down through the ages tell of a city where the houses were not built of stone or wood, but of silver brick, polished until they gleamed like moonlight, even in the height of the day. The roofs were not thatched with palm fronds, but tiled with plates of beaten gold, thin enough to tremble in the breeze. When the trade winds blew across the lake, the entire city would sing, 1,000 golden chimes creating a low, harmonic hum that resonated through the chests of anyone lucky enough to stand at the gates. The streets of Manoa were said to be wide and dustless, paved with cobblestones of porphyry and jasper, leading to central plazas where fountains flowed not with water, but with liquid essences of tropical fruits, offering eternal refreshment. Surrounding the city were gardens that never knew the brown touch of autumn. Here the flora was as legendary as the architecture. It was said that flowers the size of dinner plates bloomed in colours that the human eye had never seen before, shades of ultraviolet and deep, pulsating indigo that seemed to glow with their own internal light. Guarding the gates of this golden empire were not soldiers in iron armour, but beasts of the forest that had been tamed by the sheer sanctity of the place. Jaguars with coats of rosetted silk dozed on the steps of the temples, their amber eyes watching the horizon with an ancient, quiet intelligence. Great macaws, their feathers spun from sapphire and ruby, roosted on the golden eaves, their calls echoing over the water like the bells of a cathedral. This was the image that haunted the sleep of thousands. But why? Why did this specific dream take such a hold on the human spirit? To understand El Dorado, we must understand the psychological pull of gold itself. In the modern world, we think of gold as currency, a way to store value. But to the ancients, and to the explorers who sought it, gold was something far more profound. Gold is the metal that does not tarnish. Iron rusts, turning back to red earth. Copper turns green and corrodes. Silver blackens with time. But gold remains pure. It is chemically aloof, refusing to bond with oxygen, refusing to decay. If you bury a gold mask in the mud for 1,000 years, when you wipe away the dirt, it shines with the exact same brilliance as the day it was cast. Because of this, gold was not seen merely as metal, it was seen as the tears of the sun. It was a physical manifestation of immortality. For the men of Europe, coming from a continent ravaged by plague, cold winters, and the grey stone of fortress walls, the idea of a city made of this immortal substance was intoxicating. It represented a triumph over death itself. They believed that in El Dorado the people did not age. They believed that the king of this city possessed a secret knowledge, a connection to the divine that allowed his people to live in a state of perpetual harvest, free from the hunger and the rot that plagued the rest of the world. The rumours of Manoa grew more elaborate with every retelling. Sailors in the taverns of Seville and Lisbon would lower their voices, leaning in over cups of wine to describe the interior of the emperor's palace. They spoke of a throne room where the statues were life-sized casts of pure gold, golden deer, golden jaguars, even golden trees with wires for branches and emeralds for leaves. They whispered of the great golden one, a king who was so wealthy that he did not wear clothes of woven fabric. Instead, he coated his skin in a sticky, aromatic resin each morning, and then stood while his servants blew gold dust through reed pipes onto his body. He became a living statue, a human sun walking among mortals, only to wash the fortune away in the lake at sunset, a daily offering that meant nothing to him because his wealth was infinite. This fantasy was a powerful narcotic. It drew men away from their families, away from the safety of their homes, and pulled them across the terrifying expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. They were chasing a mirage, yes, but it was a mirage constructed from their deepest desires, the desire for eternal warmth, for endless wealth, and for a life that transcended the gritty, painful reality of the 16th century. The city of Manoa, shimmering on the edge of Lake Parim, became the ultimate destination. It was the place where the map ended and the dream began. It was a phantom that hovered just beyond the tree line. Every time an expedition failed, every time a group of starving men stumbled out of the jungle with empty hands, they did not say, "The city does not exist." They said, "We did not go deep enough. We did not march far enough. It is just over the next ridge, just around the next bend of the river." And so the dream remained alive, fed by the very impossibility of its existence. It was a golden beacon in the green dark, calling out to the adventurous and the greedy, promising them that if they could just endure the biting insects, the sweltering heat, and the crushing silence of the rainforest, they would find a paradise where the roofs sang in the wind and the streets paved with light would lead them to glory. But as we drift deeper into this story, we must leave the fantasy behind for a moment. We must strip away the golden tiles and the singing roofs. We must turn our gaze away from the imaginary Lake Parim and look toward the real mountains of South America. For beneath the layers of myth, there was a seed of truth. There was a real people, a real culture, and a real ritual that sparked this global obsession. But to find them, we must ascend. We must climb out of the humid, feverish lowlands and go up into the clouds to the high, cold plateaus of the Andes. The air here is different. If you were to stand on the high plateau known as the Altiplano Cundiboyacense in what is now central Colombia, the first thing you would notice is the silence. It is a profound, heavy silence, broken only by the sound of the wind rushing over vast stretches of high-altitude grass. The air is thin and crisp, carrying a chill that settles deep in the bones, a stark contrast to the sweating heat of the Amazon jungle below. Here, at over 8,500 feet above sea level, the sky feels closer. The clouds do not float high above. They drift right through the valleys, wrapping the mountains in shawls of grey mist. This is a land of eternal autumn, a place of damp earth, rolling fog, and emerald green lakes that sit like dark eyes staring up at the heavens. This was the home of the Muisca. Long before the Spanish galleons broke the horizon of the Atlantic, the Muisca people, also known as the Chibcha, had built a sophisticated and peaceful civilization in these high clouds. They were not empire builders like the Aztecs of Mexico or the Incas of Peru. They did not have vast standing armies or monumental stone fortresses. Instead, they were a people of the earth, deeply connected to the rhythms of the seasons and the spiritual potency of the landscape around them. To imagine the Muisca, picture a people wrapped in thick, warm cloaks of woven cotton, dyed in earthy reds and deep charcoals to ward off the Andean chill. They lived in circular houses called bojillos, made of cane and clay, with conical thatched roofs that shed the constant drizzle of the highlands. These homes were warm and smoky inside, filled with the scent of burning wood and maize. The walls were often painted with geometric patterns, symbols of their cosmology, the frog, the sun, the moon, representing the cycle of life and water. The Muisca were master agriculturalists. They looked out over the savannah and saw not a wilderness, but a garden. They created raised terraces to control the water levels, growing maize, potatoes, quinoa, and coca. But their true wealth, the engine of their economy, was not gold. It was something far more practical, yet equally precious in the ancient world: salt and emeralds. The Muisca controlled the great salt springs of Zipaquira and Nemocon. They would evaporate the brine in ceramic pots to create cakes of pure white salt, which was a vital nutrient and a preservative for all the tribes of the region. They also mined the mountains for emeralds, digging deep into the dark veins of the rock to pull out the green stones that captured the light of the forest. Because they controlled the salt and the emeralds, the Muisca were the great traders of the Andes. They established markets where tribes from the hot lowlands would travel up the mountain paths to trade. The lowlanders brought cotton, tropical feathers, coca leaves, and most importantly, gold. It is crucial to understand this distinction. The Muisca did not have gold mines. There were no veins of gold in their high plateau. Every ounce of gold they possessed had to be traded for. It came from the valleys of the Magdalena River and other regions far away. And yet, despite not having their own mines, the Muisca were famous for their gold work. But their relationship with the metal was fundamentally different from the European obsession. To the Spanish conquistador, gold was currency. It was status, power, and the ability to buy armies and castles. To the Muisca, gold was Naya. It was spiritual energy. They believed that gold was the physical residue of the sun's energy. It was luminous, unchanging, and sacred. It belonged to the gods, specifically to Su, the sun god. Therefore, gold was not meant to be hoarded or spent. It was meant to be returned to the earth. Muisca goldsmiths were artisans of the highest order, but they did not create heavy, solid bars of bullion. They created delicate, intricate votive figures called tunjos. Imagine a small, flat figure, no longer than your finger, cast in gold or tumbaga, a copper-gold alloy that turned a beautiful reddish colour. These figures depicted daily life, a mother holding a child, a warrior with a spear, a hunter with a deer, or a serpent coiling in the grass. The process of making them was a quiet act of devotion. The smith would use the lost wax technique. First, he would shape the figure out of beeswax and resin, his warm fingers moulding the soft material into the shape of a man or an animal. He would add tiny details, threads of wax to represent necklaces, earrings, or weapons. Then the wax model was encased in clay and fired. The heat would melt the wax, which would flow out, leaving a hollow void in the hardened clay. Finally, molten gold was poured into the space where the wax once was. When the clay was broken away, the gold figure remained. These tunjos were rough, textured, and alive with the hand of the maker. They were not polished to a high shine. The Muisca preferred the matte, textured surface, which they believed held more spiritual power. But here is the tragedy and the beauty of it. These masterpieces were not made to be displayed in a museum or worn as jewellery. They were made to be thrown away. The Muisca believed that to keep the balance of the world, they had to make offerings to the lakes, the caves, and the mountains. The lakes in particular were seen as portals to the underworld, the cosmic womb of the mother goddess, Batwe. And so a Muisca man, perhaps seeking a blessing for his harvest or protection for his family, would take the golden tunjo he had traded so much salt to acquire. He would hike up into the misty Paramo, the high moorlands where the strange Frailer Jones plants stand like silent monks in the fog. He would approach the edge of a sacred lagoon, the water dark and still. With a prayer whispered into the cold wind, he would toss the gold into the water. Plip, a small ripple, and then silence. The gold was gone. It had been returned to the gods. It was not lost. It was where it belonged. For centuries, the bottom of these Andean lakes accumulated thousands upon thousands of these golden offerings, lying in the silt and the mud, hidden by the cold, dark water. This spiritual detachment from material wealth is difficult for the modern mind to grasp, and it was completely incomprehensible to the Europeans who would eventually arrive. The Spanish saw gold as an end in itself. The Muisca saw it as a medium of communication with the divine. The landscape of the Muisca was a sacred geography. Every mountain peak, every cave and every body of water had a story and a spirit. The mist that clung to the hillsides was the breath of the ancestors. The rainbows that arched over the savannah were deities. Among all these sacred places, there was one lake that held a special significance. It was a perfectly circular body of water, formed perhaps by a meteorite strike thousands of years ago, or as the Muisca believed, by the finger of a god pressing into the earth. It sat high in the mountains, a bowl of water held up to the sky. This was Lake Guatavita. It was here, at this remote and quiet lake, surrounded by a rim of lush green vegetation and shrouded in the eternal fog of the Andes, that a specific ritual took place. It was a ceremony of succession, a coronation of a new leader. It was a moment of such visual splendour that the stories of it would travel down the mountains, drift along the rivers, cross the ocean, and eventually mutate into the fevered dream of El Dorado. But before the myth grew legs and walked across the world, it was just a moment in time. A cold morning on the edge of a crater lake, the smell of burning Relaxation's wood, the sound of flutes and drums echoing off the water, and a man standing naked, waiting to be turned into the sun. To understand how the legend began, we must look at the water of Lake Guatavita, not as a place to find treasure, but as the stage for a love story, a tragedy, and a resurrection. The lake was not just water, it was the home of the dragon, the snake god, the guardian of the deep. And it is there, by the water's edge, that our history truly begins to merge with the legend. To find the beating heart of the legend, one must travel north from the sprawling savannas of Bogota and ascend into the jagged embrace of the mountains. The journey is not merely a movement across distance, but a traversal through layers of atmosphere. The air grows thin and rarefied, stripped of the humidity of the valleys, becoming crisp and sharp in the lungs. The noise of the world falls away, replaced by the hushed whisper of the wind moving through the Paramo, the high-altitude moorland where the earth touches the clouds. Here, the landscape is prehistoric, dominated by the Relaxations, strange and silent plants with thick, velvety leaves and yellow flowers that stand like solemn monks guarding a secret. It is here, nestled within a depression of the earth that seems too perfect to be natural, that Lake Guatavita sleeps. The lake is a perfect circle, a ring of emerald water held in the cupped hands of the mountain. It looks less like a geographical feature and more like an eye staring unblinkingly at the sky. Some say the depression was formed by the violent kiss of a meteorite, a stone falling from the heavens to mark the spot. Others believe it was the thumbprint of a god who wished to test the softness of the world he had created. But regardless of its origin, the geometry of the place commands a reverent silence. The walls of the crater rise steeply on all sides, covered in a tapestry of lush, tangled vegetation, ferns, orchids, and mosses that drink from the perpetual mist. The water itself is not the blue of the ocean, nor the clear transparency of a running stream. It is dark, deep, and opaque. It is the colour of crushed jade, or the skin of an avocado, a heavy, motionless green that conceals everything beneath its surface. When the fog rolls over the rim of the crater, as it does nearly every afternoon, the lake disappears entirely, swallowed by the white vapour until it feels as though the ground has dissolved into pure cloud. It is a place of profound atmosphere, where the temperature rarely rises above a damp chill. The silence here is physical. It presses against the ears. The only sounds are the occasional cry of an Andean eagle circling the currents above, or the soft rhythmic lapping of the water against the reeds at the shore. It is a landscape that invites introspection, a place where the barrier between the physical world and the spiritual world feels incredibly thin. And it was this thinness, this palpable sense of presence, that drew the Muisca people to its shores. For the indigenous people, this was not just a body of water, it was a doorway. They believed that the lake was the residence of a powerful spirit, a dragon or a great serpent that coiled in the freezing, lightless depths. But this serpent was not a monster to be slain. It was a guardian, a deity inextricably linked to the history of their own rulers. The sanctity of Lake Guatavita began not with gold, but with a tragedy, a story of love, betrayal, and water that was told around the fires of the Muisca long before the first Spanish boot touched the sand of the Caribbean. The legend speaks of a great Zipa, a chieftain who ruled over the region with a stern and powerful hand. He was a man of war and politics, consumed by the duties of leadership, often leaving his young and beautiful wife alone in the great halls of their enclosure. Isolation can be a dangerous companion, and in the chieftain's absence, the chieftain's wife found solace in the arms of a handsome warrior from the royal guard. It was a stolen happiness, a warmth found in the cold expanse of the mountains, but like all secrets in a close-knit community, it could not be kept forever. When the Zipa discovered the betrayal, his wrath was not the hot, explosive anger of a soldier, but the cold, cruel calculation of a king. He did not execute the lovers. Instead, he devised a punishment designed to break the spirit. He ordered the warrior killed and his body desecrated, but for his wife he reserved a torture of the mind. He commanded the people of the village to compose songs about her adultery, crude, mocking verses that detailed her sin and her shame. He hired drunks and musicians to follow her wherever she went, singing these songs, chanting them outside her sleeping quarters, ensuring that she could never escape the echo of her mistake. Day after day, night after night, the music of her humiliation surrounded her. She was a queen, yet she was an outcast in her own home, stripped of dignity, wrapped in a blanket of noise and judgment. The psychological weight became too heavy to bear. The mountains, which had once been her protection, now felt like the walls of a prison. One morning, when the mist was thick and the village was still waking, she made her decision. She took her young daughter, the child of the chieftain, into her arms. She did not pack clothes or food. She simply walked out of the village, her bare feet pressing into the cold mud of the path. She climbed the steep trail leading up to the rim of the crater. The songs of the village faded behind her, replaced by the wind and the silence of the high Paramo. When she reached the edge of Lake Guatavita, she stopped. The water lay below, dark and welcoming, a mirror that reflected nothing but the grey sky. It offered a silence that she had been denied for so long. According to the legend, she did not hesitate. With her child clutched tight against her chest, she leaped from the ledge. The water accepted them without a struggle. They sank beneath the green surface, the ripples expanding outward until they touched the shore, and then vanishing. When the Zipa realized she was gone, panic replaced his cruelty. He ran to the lake, his heart breaking with a sudden, terrible regret. He ordered his priests, the Chaikwi, to retrieve her. The priests, who knew the secrets of the water, performed their rituals and dived into the freezing depths. They stayed under for a time that seemed impossible for mortal men. When they surfaced, they were gasping and trembling, their eyes wide with the terror of the divine. They reported that they had found the chieftain's wife. She was alive, but she was no longer the woman he had known. She sat in a palace at the bottom of the lake, a structure of underwater stone and weaving weeds. The dragon of the lake, the great serpent god, had taken her as his wife. She was now a goddess of the deep, a queen of the water, and the dragon coiled around her feet like a loyal hound. She had told the priests that she would never return to the world of men. She was home. The Zipa, consumed by grief, understood that he had lost her to a power greater than himself. To honour her and to ensure the prosperity of his people, he declared the lake a sacred sanctuary. He began to send offerings down to her, emeralds, food, and gold, to appease the dragon and to ask for the blessing of the woman he had driven into the water. This legend rooted the lake in the psyche of the Muisca people. It became the womb of the goddess, a place where the earth opened up to receive the gifts of the living. It was this story that set the stage for the ritual that would captivate the world. The offerings began as acts of penance and love, but over generations they evolved into a ceremony of supreme political and spiritual importance. The legend of the wife became the foundation for the reality of the Golden Man. The transition from myth to ritual was seamless. The Muisca believed that their rulers derived their power from the sun, Su, but their legitimacy was confirmed by the water, Si. The inauguration of a new Zipa was the moment where these two elements, fire and water, gold and lake, would meet. The ceremony of El Hombre Dorado was not a daily occurrence, nor was it a casual display of wealth. It was a rare, once-in-a-generation event, occurring only when an old ruler died and his nephew, as inheritance was matrilineal, was ready to take the throne. The preparation for this moment was grueling. The young heir would be sequestered in a cave for months, sometimes years before the ceremony. During this time of confinement, he was forbidden from seeing the sun. He could not eat salt or chili peppers. He could not be in the company of women. He lived in total darkness and silence, meditating, purifying his spirit, stripping away his humanity so that he could become a vessel for the divine. When the period of isolation ended, the day of the ceremony arrived. It would begin before dawn, under the cover of the last stars. The location, of course, was the sacred crater of Guatavita. Imagine the scene. The air is biting cold, the temperature hovering just above freezing. The sky to the east is beginning to bruise with the first purple light of the coming morning, but the bowl of the crater is still steeped in shadow. Thousands of people have gathered on the steep, sloping banks of the lake. They have come from all over the Confederation, farmers, warriors, weavers, and potters. They stand shoulder to shoulder on the muddy slopes, wrapped in their cotton mantles. Despite the size of the crowd, there is a profound discipline. The accounts say that the Muisca watched in silence or spoke only in hushed whispers. Fires burned all around the rim of the crater, hundreds of orange flames flickering against the darkness, casting long, dancing shadows on the water below. The smell of the air was thick and intoxicating. Priests burned immense amounts of mulke, a native incense, along with resinous woods. The smoke drifted over the lake, creating a carpet of white fog that mingled with the natural mist, turning the crater into a swirling cauldron of scent and shadow. At the water's edge, a raft was waiting. It was made of rushes and reeds, dried and bound together, similar to the boats used on Lake Titicaca. But this raft was beautifully decorated, draped in fine textiles, painted in red and black, and adorned with flowers that had been carried up from the warmer valleys. On the raft stood 4 braziers, burning more incense, sending distinct pillars of smoke straight up into the still air. Then the initiate appeared. He was stripped of his robes, standing naked in the biting cold, but he did not shiver. This was his moment of transfiguration. The priests approached him with bowls of a sticky, viscous substance. It was a mixture of turpentine resin and honey, a thick amber glue that smelled of pine and sweetness. They used their hands to coat his entire body. They covered his hair, his face, his eyelids, his torso, his legs. Every inch of his skin was sealed in the resin. Next came the transformation. The priests took up hollow reeds filled with fine gold dust. They blew the dust onto his sticky skin. It was a soft glittering cloud that settled over him, adhering to the resin. Layer after layer was applied until the brown of his skin disappeared entirely. He was no longer a man of flesh and blood. He had become a statue of living metal. He was a reflection of the sun, waiting for his celestial father to rise. The visual impact of this must have been overwhelming. In a world without electric light, without mirrors, without glass, the sight of a human being turned into solid gold would have been terrifyingly beautiful. He embodied the Nia, the spiritual energy of the sun. The golden man, the El Dorado, stepped onto the raft. He was joined by 4 principal chieftains, his subject lords, who were also naked but adorned with heavy gold jewellery, crowns of feathers and gold, bracelets and chest plates that clinked softly as they moved. These 4 attendants represented the 4 directions, the stability of the earth. The raft was pushed gently from the shore. It drifted silently toward the centre of the lake. The only sound was the stroke of the oars breaking the black water and the crackle of the fires on the shore. The crowd watched, their breath misting in the cold air. Timing was everything. The ceremony was a piece of cosmic theatre choreographed to the second. As the raft reached the precise centre of the circular lake, the sun crested the high rim of the mountains. The effect was instantaneous. The first rays of the morning sun, cutting through the thin mountain air, struck the centre of the lake. They hit the golden man. Suddenly he ignited. The gold dust on his skin caught the light, and he blazed like a supernova in the middle of the dark water. To the people watching from the shadows of the shore, it would have looked as if a piece of the sun had fallen to earth and was floating on the water. He was blinding, radiant, divine. At this moment the silence was broken. The music began. Flutes made of bone, drums made of hollowed logs and deerskin, and clay ocarinas. The sound reverberated off the crater walls, amplifying into a thunderous, rhythmic pulse. On the raft, the golden man raised his arms to the sky, acknowledging his father, the sun. Then he lowered them to the water, acknowledging his mother, the lake. He picked up the offerings that had been piled at his feet. There were emeralds the size of eggs, dug from the dark mines of Muisca. There were tunjos, those delicate gold figures of warriors and snakes. There were jars of fermented chicha. One by one, he dropped them into the water. They splashed and sank, spiralling down into the cold dark to the palace of the dragon goddess below. The 4 chieftains with him did the same, emptying their treasures into the deep. Then came the climax of the ritual. The golden man stood at the edge of the raft. The music swelled, the smoke swirled. With a single motion, he dove. He broke the surface of the water, plunging into the icy green depths. Under the water, he scrubbed his skin. The resin dissolved, the honey melted, and the gold dust washed away. It drifted down like a shimmering rain, a cloud of glitter slowly sinking to the bottom, covering the mud in a layer of holy metal. When he surfaced, he was clean. He emerged from the water not as a god, but as a man. The gold had been given to the lake. It was the payment for his right to rule. He climbed back onto the raft, shivering now, water streaming from his dark hair. The return journey to the shore was a celebration. The solemnity broke. The people cheered. The fires were stoked higher, and the chicha began to flow. The king had been accepted by the earth. The balance was maintained. The cycle of life could continue. This was the reality of El Dorado. It was not a city. It was not a palace. It was a man, covered in dust, for a few brief moments at sunrise. It was a fleeting, ephemeral union of light and water. But to the European mind, this truth was too abstract, too poetic. When the stories of this ceremony began to trickle down from the mountains, carried by traders and captured prisoners, the nuance was lost in translation. The Spanish heard golden man and imagined a king who wore gold every day. They heard of the offerings thrown into the lake and calculated the value of centuries of accumulation. They heard of the emeralds and saw only profit. They did not understand that the gold was safe in the lake, not because it was guarded by soldiers, but because it was guarded by sanctity. To the Muisca, taking the gold back out of the lake would be like digging up a grave to steal the clothes of the dead. It was unthinkable. The gold was gone. It belonged to the other world. But the explorers who were slowly hacking their way through the jungles to the north did not believe in the other world. They believed in this one. And in this world they needed gold. The image of the man shining on the raft became a seed that, once planted in the fertile soil of their greed, grew into a monstrous, consuming vine. They began to wonder, if the king throws that much gold away, how much must he have left in his city? If he washes a fortune off his skin every morning, what must his streets be made of? The specific ritual at Lake Guatavita had actually ceased by the time the Spanish arrived, likely due to intertribal conflicts or a shift in religious practice. The last true ceremony had happened decades before the first conquistador set foot in the Andes, but the memory of it was fresh. The ghost of the Golden Man was still haunting the lake, and his shadow was long enough to reach across the ocean. As the fires of the ceremony faded in the historical memory of the Muisca, a new fire was being lit in the imagination of the invaders. The silence of the lake, which had protected the dragon and the goddess for so long, was about to be broken by the sound of iron picks, gunpowder, and the heavy boots of men who looked at the water and saw only a bank vault waiting to be breached. But before the iron arrived, let us linger for a moment longer in the peace of the ritual. Let us hold the image of the lake as it was, a quiet, misty eye of the earth, where the only thing that mattered was the balance between the sun above and the water below. The wind still blows through the Fraujones. The water still laps against the shore, and deep in the mud, beneath the layers of silt and thyme, the dust of the golden man still sleeps, untouched, returned to the earth from which it came. The stillness of the lake is hypnotic. The ripples move in slow motion, expanding, fading, expanding, fading. It is a rhythm that mimics the breath of a sleeper, in and out, rise and fall. The cold air feels like a heavy blanket, weighing down the eyelids. The story of the Muisca is a story of balance, of giving back what was taken. It is a story that asks nothing of us but to listen, and to imagine the glitter of gold sinking into the green dark, slowly, softly finding its rest. As the sun climbs higher in the sky of our imagination, the ceremony ends. The crowds disperse, walking back over the ridges, back to their round houses, back to their fields of maize. The fires burn down to embers, the smoke clears, and the lake is left alone once more, holding its secrets in the cold, crushing deep. But the secrets would not stay kept. Rumours have wings, and gold has a voice that calls out over great distances. Far to the north, on the sweltering coast of the Caribbean, strange ships were anchoring. Men with pale faces and metal skins were asking questions. They were holding up pieces of gold and pointing to the mountains. They were learning the words for king and lake. The whisper was starting to travel. From the high Andes it drifted down the Magdalena River, carried by the currents, passing through the dense jungles, past the jaguars and the howling monkeys, until it reached the ears of men who were starving for a miracle. The distortion was beginning. The golden man was shedding his humanity and becoming a place. El Indio Dorado was becoming El Dorado. And so the serene, sacred silence of Lake Guatavita was about to be shattered by the noise of the greatest treasure hunt in human history. The dream was about to become a fever, but that is the next step in our journey. For now we rest by the water, watching the mist roll in, covering the world in white, soft sleep. Far to the north of the silent, mist-shrouded lake, where the cool air of the Andes gives way to the suffocating embrace of the tropics, the ocean meets the land in a crash of turquoise and white foam. We must now let our minds drift down from the high peaks, following the rush of the rivers until they widen and slow, spilling into the Caribbean Sea. It is here, on the sweltering coast of what is now Colombia, that the next chapter of our story begins. It is here that the silence of the ritual was replaced by the clanking of iron, the creaking of timber, and the murmuring of a rumour that would consume the world. The year is the early 1530s. The location is the settlement of Santa Marta. To understand the atmosphere of this place, you must imagine a heat that is physical, a heavy, wet blanket that settles over everything. The sun does not merely shine, it strikes the earth with a hammer. The air smells of salt spray, rotting seaweed, and the sharp metallic tang of rusted armour. The men who stood on these sandy shores were not the romantic heroes of storybooks. They were hard, desperate men. They were the Segundones, the second sons of Spain. In the rigid hierarchy of Europe, the firstborn inherited the land and the titles. The second sons inherited nothing but a family name and a sword. If they wanted a life of their own, they had to carve it out of the unknown. They had arrived in the New World too late for the easy victories. Hernán Cortés had already conquered the Aztecs in Mexico, sending galleons of gold back to the Spanish crown. Francisco Pizarro had already toppled the Inca Empire in Peru, filling rooms with silver. The men in Santa Marta and Cartagena looked at these stories with a hunger that gnawed at their bellies. They were stranded on the edge of a hostile continent, battling tropical diseases, poisonous arrows, and the crushing boredom of a frontier that offered no riches. They were deeply in debt to the bankers who had financed their voyages. They needed a win. They needed an empire. They needed a legend. It was in this climate of desperation that the game of telephone began. The indigenous people of the coast watched these bearded strangers with a mixture of fear and confusion. They saw men who sweated in heavy wool and metal under the tropical sun, men who seemed possessed by a singular madness, the lust for the yellow metal. The coastal tribes did not have much gold of their own, but they had stories. They knew of the trade routes that led up the great rivers to the high mountains. They knew of the Muisca, the people of the salt, who lived in the clouds and possessed the spiritual energy of the sun. When the Spanish captors interrogated the indigenous translators, a profound linguistic tragedy occurred. The Spanish would ask, "Where is the gold?" The translators, perhaps trying to explain the ritual of the lake, would speak of El Indio Dorado, the golden Indian. They described a man who was covered in gold. But the European mind, shaped by the architecture of cities and the structure of feudal kingdoms, could not grasp the concept of a ritual that threw wealth away. When they heard golden man, their imagination expanded it. If there is a golden man, he must have a golden palace. If there is a palace, there must be a golden city. And if there is a city, it must be the capital of a golden empire. The word Dorado shifted from an adjective describing a person to a noun describing a place. The specific sacred ritual of Lake Guatavita was stripped of its spiritual context and reassembled into a geographical target. The indigenous guides soon learned that this story was their most powerful weapon. If they pointed a finger toward the mountains and said, "The gold is there," far away, the dangerous men with the metal skins would pack up and leave. It became a survival strategy. "Not here," they would say, "further on, over the mountains, in the land of the Muisca." And so the whisper travelled. It moved from the lips of a translator to the ear of a captain, then to the quill of a scribe, and finally into the dreams of the soldiers sleeping in their hammocks. The story mutated with every retelling. By the time it circulated through the campfires of Santa Marta, it was no longer a story about a chieftain offering dust to a lake. It was a story about a land where gold was as common as dirt. The atmosphere in the Spanish settlements changed. The air became charged with a nervous electricity. The lethargy of the heat was replaced by the frantic energy of preparation. They were no longer guarding a mosquito-infested beach. They were the threshold of a new Peru. They were about to march into the unknown, guided only by a rumour and the terrifying confidence of men who have nothing left to lose. Leading this charge was a man who did not fit the mould of the conquistador. Gonzalo Jiménez de Quesada was not a soldier by trade. He was a lawyer. He was a man of letters, educated in the great universities of Spain, accustomed to the quiet of a library and the scratch of a pen on parchment. He had come to the New World to bring order, to serve as a magistrate, but the fever of the coast changed him. The stories of El Dorado seduced the intellectual just as they had seduced the soldier. In 1536, Quesada was given command of an expedition that would become one of the most grueling odysseys in the history of exploration. His mission was ostensibly to find a path to Peru, to link the colonies, but in the back of every man's mind was the Golden City. The sheer scale of the undertaking was immense. Quesada assembled an army of over 800 men. They gathered on the beach, a sea of helmets and pikes. There were horses, expensive and rare, which were treated better than the foot soldiers. There were packs of war dogs. There were thousands of indigenous porters forced into service. They stood at the mouth of the Magdalena River, the great artery that ran from the heart of the Andes down to the Caribbean. The river was their road. They believed it would lead them straight to the high civilizations they sought. They did not know that the Magdalena was not a road, but a dragon that would try to swallow them whole. As they stepped off the known map and into the green abyss, the mood was high. Banners snapped in the ocean breeze. Priests blessed the troops. But as the last ship faded from the horizon and the walls of the jungle closed in around them, the reality of the continent began to set in. The March of Jimenez de Quesada is a story of slow, grinding attrition. It is a story that should be told in the rhythm of a heavy boot pulling out of deep mud. Squelch, step, squelch, step. They split into two groups. One group moved by water, navigating heavy brigantines up the river against the current. The other group, led by Quesada himself, marched along the banks. Both routes were treacherous. The Magdalena River is a beast of water. It is wide, brown, and churning, carrying the silt of the mountains and the debris of the rainforest. The current is powerful and relentless. The boats had to be poled and rowed against the flow, fighting for every inch of progress. Hidden sandbars grounded the keels. Submerged logs, massive as leviathans, threatened to punch holes in the hulls. And the river was alive. Crocodiles, ancient and armoured, sunned themselves on the banks, slipping into the water with terrifying speed as the boats approached. But for the men marching on the land, the horror was even more intimate. There was no path. The jungle grew right down to the water's edge, a tangled wall of vines, thorny palms, and massive roots. The soldiers had to hack their way through with machetes, swinging their arms until their muscles burned, advancing only a few miles a day. The heat inside the jungle was suffocating. It was a greenhouse, humid and still. The men were wearing quilted cotton armour or heavy padded jackets to protect against arrows, and under these layers they stewed in their own sweat. Their skin chafed and rotted. Fungi bloomed in the damp folds of their clothing. Then came the rain. In the tropical lowlands, it does not simply rain. The sky opens and water falls in sheets, warm and heavy. It turned the earth into a slurry of mud that reached the knees. The horses struggled, their hooves sinking deep, panic in their eyes as they thrashed to find purchase. Men would slip and fall, coated in slime, too exhausted to stand. They slept in the mud. They ate in the mud. The mud became their world. And with the rain came the insects. As evening fell, the air would begin to hum. Clouds of mosquitoes, sandflies, and gnats descended on the column. There was no repellent, no netting. The men were bitten until their faces were swollen and unrecognisable. Fevers swept through the ranks. Malaria, yellow fever, dysentery. Men who had started the march as strong, proud soldiers began to wither. They would fall behind, leaning against a tree for a moment of rest, and the jungle would simply absorb them. They were never seen again. The wildlife was a constant psychological terror. At night, the jungle came alive with sounds that the Europeans had never heard before. The roar of the howler monkeys echoed through the canopy like the screams of the damned, terrifying the men who thought they were hearing demons. Jaguars stalked the periphery of the campfires, their eyes reflecting the flames, waiting for a straggler to wander into the dark. To sleep on the ground was to invite death. Snakes, specifically the deadly fer-de-lance, lay camouflaged in the leaf litter. One wrong step, one hand placed carelessly on the ground to steady oneself, meant a bite that would turn flesh necrotic within hours. The soldiers learned to sleep in the trees, tying their hammocks high in the branches, swaying above the wet earth like strange, metallic cocoons. Quesada, the lawyer, proved to be a leader of iron will. He walked among his men, not riding, suffering the same privations. He forbade them from turning back. He knew that to turn back was to admit ruin. He kept the rumour of the goal dangling before them like a lantern in the dark. Just a little further, he would say, the mountains are close. But the mountains were not close. Weeks turned into months. The food ran out. Starvation is a quiet, slow madness. It strips away civilization layer by layer. The expedition had started with salt pork, biscuits, and wine. That was gone within the first few weeks. They began to forage for roots and berries, often poisoning themselves with unknown plants. They ate the lizards they could catch. They ate the monkeys. As the hunger deepened, they looked at their leather gear with new eyes. They began to boil the leather of their saddles. They cut strips from their boots and softened them in boiling water, chewing on the tough hide just to feel something in their stomachs. They ate the scabbards of their swords. It is said that some men even looked at the bodies of the dead with a hunger they dared not voice. The indigenous villages they encountered were often abandoned, the people having fled into the forest at the approach of the strange, loud column. The Spanish would tear through the empty huts, finding perhaps a handful of maize or some dried fish, fighting each other for the scraps. The river seemed endless. The jungle seemed infinite. The golden city felt like a cruel joke. The expedition was dying. Of the 800 men who had left Santa Marta, hundreds were already dead. Their bodies were left in the mud of the riverbank, marked only by crude wooden crosses that would rot away in weeks. The atmosphere of the march shifted from hope to a grim, robotic determination. They were sleepwalkers, moving only because to stop was to die. The sound of the march was the sound of coughing, of hacking machetes, and the sucking noise of boots pulling free from the swamp. And then, just as the expedition was on the brink of total collapse, the landscape began to change. They had reached the Opon River, a tributary that flowed down from the eastern mountains. The guides they had captured along the way pointed up this river. The salt people, they said, the people of the high places live up there. Quesada made the decision to turn away from the Magdalena and ascend. It was a gamble. They had to climb the sheer face of the Andes. The ascent was a different kind of torture. The heat of the jungle faded, replaced by a biting cold for which they were unprepared. Their clothes were rags, rotting off their bodies. They had no winter gear. They climbed steep, rocky paths where horses slipped and fell hundreds of feet into ravines. The air grew thin, making every breath a struggle. But as they climbed, the jungle began to thin. The wall of green broke apart. The claustrophobia of the rainforest gave way to the open vistas of the mountains. It was early in the year 1537. The expedition had been marching for nearly a year. They crested a final ridge, exhausted, starving, skeleton thin, their eyes hollow and haunted. They looked out, expecting another endless expanse of green peaks. Instead, they saw the savanna of Bogotá. It was a shock to the senses. Spread out before them was a high, flat plateau, bathed in the soft golden light of the Andean sun. It was a land of tamed fields, of organised agriculture. They saw patches of maize and potatoes stretching to the horizon. They saw smoke rising from hundreds of chimneys. They saw well-maintained paths and circular houses. They had found the Muisca Confederation. The 160 survivors stood on that ridge and wept. They were not weeping for gold, not yet. They were weeping because they saw smoke, which meant fire, which meant warmth. They saw fields, which meant food. They saw a civilization. Quesada, leaning on his sword, looked down at this new world. He had left Santa Marta with an army. He arrived with a company of ghosts. But he had arrived. The rumours of the Golden Man had led them through the gates of hell and out the other side. The transition from the jungle to the plateau was absolute. The noise of the howler monkeys and the buzzing insects was gone, replaced by the sound of the wind in the high grass and the distant barking of dogs from the villages below. The air was cool and clean, but the peace of the plateau was an illusion. The Spanish were not guests, they were invaders, and although they were few in number, they were desperate, and they were armed with steel and horses, beasts the Muisca had never seen. The discovery of the Muisca homeland was the beginning of the end for the indigenous confederation, but for the legend of El Dorado, it was like pouring oil onto a dying fire. The Spanish descended from the ridge, their hunger for food quickly replaced by their old hunger for gold. They entered the villages, their eyes scanning every chest, every neck, every wrist for the glint of the yellow metal, and they found it. They found emeralds. They found gold plates hanging outside the houses of the chiefs, chiming in the wind. But they did not find a city of gold. They found a city of wood and straw that possessed gold. The distinction mattered little to Quesada's men. They believed they had found the outer provinces of the Golden Empire. They believed the capital, the true source, was just a little further. The tragedy of the encounter was immediate. The Muisca, seeing these bearded, starving aliens riding on terrible monsters, believed them to be children of the sun, or perhaps demons sent to punish them. The clash of cultures was violent and confusing. The Spanish, despite their small numbers, used terror and shock tactics. They captured the local leaders. They demanded to know where the gold came from. The answer was always the same. We trade for it. We do not dig it. This confused Quesada. A wealthy empire without mines? It didn't make sense to the European mind. There had to be a source. There had to be a mine. There had to be a place where the gold came out of the ground like water. And so, even as they looted the Muisca settlements, stripping the ornaments from the living and the dead, the dissatisfaction remained. The reality of the Muisca wealth, rich in salt, rich in agriculture, with modest amounts of traded gold, was not enough to satisfy the fantasy that had sustained them through the jungle death march. They had survived the impossible, so they felt entitled to the impossible reward. They established a settlement on the plateau, which would eventually become the city of Bogotá. But Quesada's eyes were always turning to the horizon. He sent scouting parties in every direction. He interrogated every prisoner. He was looking for the lake. He was looking for the king who dusted himself in gold. The irony of history is sharp here. Quesada was standing right in the middle of the land of the Golden Man. He was breathing the same air where the ritual had taken place. But because he was looking for a city with streets of gold, he couldn't see the truth. He was looking for a physical El Dorado while standing in the spiritual one. As the sun set over the savannah, casting long shadows across the plateau, the survivors of the expedition rested in the appropriated huts of the Muisca. They polished their rusted armour, they counted their looted emeralds, and they whispered to each other that this was good. Yes, but it wasn't it. The big one was still out there. Meanwhile, unknown to Quesada, he was not the only one searching. The distortion of the myth had travelled not just up the Magdalena, but across the entire continent. While Quesada was catching his breath on the high plateau, two other massive expeditions were converging on the exact same spot, drawn by the same magnetic pull of the legend. It was to be one of the strangest coincidences in the history of exploration, a meeting of three starving armies at the top of the world. But before that strange reunion could happen, the Spanish had to come to terms with what they had found in the palaces of the Muisca. They had to learn the bitter lesson that the singing cities were just plates of gold clinking in the breeze, and that the treasure they sought was a ghost that would always be one step ahead of them. The nights on the plateau were cold, a stark difference from the sweltering jungle nights they had endured. The men slept under heavy wool cloaks, listening to the wind howl. In their dreams, the jungle still waited for them. The mud still pulled at their boots, and the Golden Man still stood on his raft, shining, beckoning, and then diving just out of reach, dissolving into the dark water of their imagination. The search had only just begun. The march of Quesada was over, but the madness of El Dorado was just finding its legs. The story was about to expand, to pull in German bankers, ruthless adventurers, and eventually the entire world. But for now, let us leave Quesada on the high ridge, looking out over the emerald fields, believing he had found the key to the treasure house of the world, unaware that he had simply opened the door to a mystery that would never be fully solved. The wind blows through the high grass, whispering the same word over and over: Dorado, Dorado, Dorado. The wind that sweeps across the high savannah of Bogotá is a storyteller. It travels over the vast flat plains of the Altiplano, rustling the high grasses and whistling through the valleys of the Andes. In the year 1539, that wind carried a scent that had never existed in this part of the world before. It was the scent of iron, of wet wool, and of three distinct desperation that were about to collide in one of history's most improbable moments. We have followed the exhausted skeletal army of Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada as they clawed their way up from the green hell of the Magdalena River. We saw them stand on the ridge, weeping at the sight of smoke and cultivated fields, believing they were the sole discoverers of this hidden kingdom. They believed the silence of the mountains belonged to them alone, but the mountains are vast, and they hold many doors. While Quesada was resting his men and counting the emeralds he had seized, the horizon was beginning to darken with the approach of strangers. It is a coincidence that strains belief, a moment where the threads of fate, spun from three different directions, were pulled tight into a single knot. To the east of the Andes lies a different kind of hell. It is the Llanos, the Great Plains. It is a sea of grass that stretches for thousands of miles, flat and endless, prone to catastrophic flooding in the rainy season and scorching heat in the dry. Through this green ocean marched an expedition led by Nicolas Federman. He was not a Spanish hidalgo seeking glory for the crown. He was a German, an agent of the Welser banking family of Augsburg. The Spanish king, Charles V, was deeply in debt to these German bankers, and in exchange for his loans, he had granted them rights to explore and exploit the province of Venezuela. Federman's journey had been a nightmare of a different colour. For 3 years his men had wandered the endless plains, searching for the passage through the mountains. They had walked until their boots disintegrated, forcing them to wrap their feet in raw deerskins. They had walked until their European clothes rotted away, replacing them with animal hides. They looked less like soldiers and more like wild beasts, sun-blackened, bearded, and hollow-eyed. They had crossed freezing mountain passes where the wind cut like a knife, driving them forward with the singular madness of the gold-seeker. They arrived on the savannah from the east, a ghostly procession emerging from the mist, stumbling into the realm of the Muisca, just as Quesada was claiming it. But the stage was not yet full. From the south, marching up the spine of the Andes from the conquered lands of Peru, came Sebastian de Belalcázar. He was a lieutenant of the great Pizarro, a man who had already seen the halls of the Inca filled with silver. He was looking for El Dorado to carve out his own kingdom, independent of his masters in Peru. His army was different. They were better equipped, dressed in fine silks and steel that still held its shine. They brought with them a great train of horses, pigs, and weaponry, a travelling court of conquest moving north in search of the gilded man. And so, on the high, cold plateau of the Andes, 3 armies met. Imagine the scene. The silence of the savannah is broken by the sound of trumpets echoing from 3 different cardinal points. The mist lifts to reveal a surreal standoff. Quesada's men, ragged and starving, stand their ground. Federman's Germans, looking like prehistoric hunters in their skins, emerge from the tree line. Belalcázar's well-armed veterans crest the southern ridge. It was a situation primed for a massacre. Here were 3 starving predators circling the same prey. The tension on the plateau was palpable, a physical weight in the air. Hands drifted to the hilts of rusted swords. Arquebuses were levelled. The horses stomped nervously in the high grass, sensing the aggression of their riders. The Muisca, watching from the hills, must have held their breath, waiting for the demons to destroy each other. But the battle never came. Perhaps it was the sheer exhaustion that stayed their hands. When you have marched for a year through swamps, when you have eaten leather to survive, when you have watched your friends die of fever and snakebite, the appetite for war diminishes. Or perhaps it was the absurdity of the moment. To travel thousands of miles through the unknown, only to bump into your own countrymen in the middle of nowhere, creates a strange kinship. Instead of a charge, there was a hesitation. A rider rode out from Quesada's lines. A rider rode out from Belalcazar's. A representative came from Federman. They met in the middle of the field, the wind whipping their banners. They spoke the same language of greed and fatigue. The atmosphere shifted from hostility to a bizarre diplomatic relief. The soldiers lowered their weapons. They looked at each other, men from Seville, men from Bavaria, men from Lima, and they saw the same hunger in each other's eyes. They saw the same madness. The leaders dismounted. Quesada, ever the lawyer, saw a solution that did not involve blood. He proposed a negotiation. Why fight over the gold when there was enough land for everyone? Why risk dying now, at the finish line? And so, on that wind-swept plain, a great peace was brokered. It is one of the strangest images in the history of the conquest. Tough, hardened killers hugging each other, weeping with relief, sharing what little food they had. The Germans marvelled at the emeralds Quesada showed them. The men from Peru shared stories of the Incas. They camped together, their fires merging into a single glowing city of tents. They agreed to split the loot. They agreed to found a city together, granting legitimacy to their claims. They named the new settlement Santa Fe de Bogota. The tension evaporated, replaced by the camaraderie of survivors. They were no longer rivals. They were partners in the looting of a world that did not belong to them. But as the fires burned low and the whiskey and chicha were passed around, the conversation inevitably returned to the one thing that united them all. "We have found emeralds," Quesada would say. "We have found salt," Federman would reply. "But where?" asked Belalcazar, staring into the embers. "Is the city of gold? Where is the source?" They had found wealth, yes, but they had not found El Dorado. The Lake of Guatavita was nearby, but the ritual had long since ended. The golden man was a ghost. They convinced themselves that the true treasure lay just a little further north, in the city of the Zac, the northern ruler of the Muisca. And so the united force turned its gaze toward the city of Hunza, known today as Tunja. The march to Tunja was different. It was not a desperate struggle for survival. It was a raid. The combined power of the three expeditions was unstoppable. They moved across the high plateau like a storm front, sweeping aside the Muisca defences. Tunja was the seat of the Zac, a ruler who was considered a deity by his people. His palace was not a stone fortress, but a sprawling complex of wood and cane, beautifully constructed and surrounded by multiple palisades. But it was the decoration of this palace that would give rise to one of the most enduring and poetic fragments of the El Dorado myth. As the Spanish and German soldiers approached the royal enclosure, they heard a sound. It was a delicate, musical shimmering. Ting, ting, sh, ting. It was the sound of the wind playing an instrument made of gold. The Zac's palace was adorned with thin, hammered plates of gold. They hung from the eaves of the roofs. They dangled from the lintels of the doors. They were suspended from the branches of the trees in the courtyard. These plates were not heavy ingots. They were sheets, light and airy, crafted to catch the slightest breeze. When the mountain wind blew through the city, the gold plates would strike against each other, creating a melodic, chiming chorus. To the weary soldiers, it must have seemed like a hallucination. They had spent years chasing a rumour, and now here it was, the singing city, the city of bells. The sensory experience of Tunja was overwhelming. The sun reflecting off the swaying gold created a dazzling, shifting light, and the air was filled with the music of the metal. But the appreciation of beauty is a fragile thing when weighed against the heaviness of greed. The soldiers did not stop to listen to the song. They stopped to calculate the weight. They burst into the enclosure. The Zak, an old and solemn man, sat on his throne, refusing to flee. He watched with a stoic silence as the strangers tore through his home. The destruction of Tunja was not a battle, it was a dismantling. The soldiers reached up and ripped the singing plates from the eaves. The music stopped, replaced by the sound of wood splintering and men shouting. They tore the ornaments from the walls. They stripped the gold from the arms of the nobles. They filled sacks with nose rings, breastplates and bracelets. The haul was enormous. It was one of the largest captures of gold in the entire history of the conquest. There were piles of gold that stood taller than a man. There were emeralds of a deep, watery green that seemed to hold the soul of the jungle. But in the midst of this frenzy, a cold realization began to settle in the stomach of the commanders. They began to interrogate the Zak and his priests. "Where is the mine?" they demanded. "Show us the mountain where you dig this." The answer they received was baffling. "We do not dig," the Muisca said. "We trade." The truth of the Muisca economy began to dawn on the invaders, and it was a truth that tasted like ash. The Muisca were salt people. They were farmers. They had accumulated this gold over centuries, trading their salt cakes and emeralds with the tribes of the hot valleys, the Punches, the Musos, the Yarraguis. The gold of Tunja was not the product of a local geological miracle. It was the product of commerce. Every piece of gold in that palace had travelled hundreds of miles, hand to hand, up the rivers and over the mountains. There was no mine. There was no mother lode. There was no El Dorado here. The disappointment that followed the looting of Tunja was a heavy, melancholy thing. They had won. They were rich men. They would return to Spain as grandees, buying castles and titles. But the dream that had sustained them, the dream of a city built on a foundation of gold, had dissolved in their hands. They had found the reservoir, but they had not found the spring. The atmosphere in the camp turned sombre. The looting continued, but it became mechanical. The beauty of the Muisca artwork meant nothing to them. To divide the spoils, they had to standardize it. The tragedy of this moment is not just in the theft, but in the erasure of art. The soldiers built great fires. They took the delicate tunjos, the figures of the goddess Batchue, the intricate rafts, the golden frogs and snakes that had been crafted with such spiritual devotion, and they threw them into the crucibles. The sound of the singing city was replaced by the roar of the smelter's fire. The delicate sheets of gold curled and blackened, melting down into shapeless blobs of yellow liquid. The history of a people, their cosmology, their prayers frozen in metal, was reduced to ingots, bars of bullion, standardized, stamped, and weighed. The smoke from the melting pots drifted over the altiplano, joining the mist and the clouds. It was the smoke of a culture evaporating. The Zak died soon after, some say of a broken heart, watching his world turned into currency. The Spanish and Germans stood around the piles of ingots, their faces illuminated by the glow of the gold. They were wealthy beyond their wildest imaginings, and yet the hunger did not fade, it simply shifted. If the Muisca traded for this, they whispered to each other, then who did they trade with? Where did those people get it? The horizon moved back. The target shifted. The myth of El Dorado was not disproven by the looting of Tunja. It was merely relocated. It must be deeper in the jungle. It must be to the east, in the vast forests where the sun rises. It must be in the land of the Omagua, or the Meta, or the Amazon. The three armies, once united by relief, eventually parted ways. Federman and Belalcazar returned to Europe to fight their legal battles for the rights to the conquest. Quesada remained, the master of the new kingdom of Granada. But the peace of the plateau was shattered forever. The wind continued to blow over the savannah, but it no longer made the city sing. The gold was gone, packed into crates, loaded onto mules, and sent down the river to the waiting ships. The silence returned to the mountains, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of a house that has been emptied, and in the minds of the dreamers, the map was being redrawn. The city of gold was still out there, hiding in the green labyrinth. The failure to find the mine at Tunja only proved that the real city was even more remote, even more guarded, and even more magnificent. The psychological trap was set. The more they found, the more they wanted. The more they searched, the further the legend retreated. As the sun sets on this chapter of the story, imagine the Altiplano as it settles into the night. The fires of the Spanish camp are dying down. The air is cold and smells of wood smoke and wet earth. The stars come out, sharp and bright in the thin air, looking down on a land that has changed forever. The ancient gods of the lakes and the mountains have retreated into the shadows, making way for the new god of the ingot. But the story does not end here. The gold of Tunja was just the appetizer. The main course, the mythical city of Manoa, was waiting in the deep, unexplored interior. And to find it, the explorers would have to leave the cool safety of the mountains and descend once again. They would have to go down, into the heat, into the unknown, into the very heart of the continent. The dream of El Dorado was evolving. It was no longer just a man on a raft. It was becoming a geography of madness. And the next men to chase it would not be satisfied with the gold of trade. They wanted the source, and they would drag thousands of souls with them into the oblivion of the Amazon in search of it. But for now, let the quiet of the high Andes wrap around you. Let the image of the singing city fade gently from your mind, leaving only the soft sound of the wind in the grass. The history is heavy, but the night is soft. We leave the conquerors to their counting, and the mountains to their slumber, drifting further down the river of time, toward the deep green dreams of the jungle. The looting of Tunja and the scouring of the Muisca plateau brought a strange and heavy silence to the Spanish soul. The conquistadors stood amidst the melted ingots, the piles of emeralds, and the ashes of the Zak's palace, and they felt a gnawing emptiness. They had captured the wealth of a kingdom, yes, but they had not found the source. They had found the river, but not the spring. The gold they held in their hands was finite. It had been traded, carried, and collected over centuries. It was not the infinite, glowing fountain of wealth they had been promised in their dreams. And so the human mind, when faced with a reality that does not match its desire, began to bend the map. If the city of gold was not here, in the high, cool mountains of the Andes, then it could not simply not exist. That was an unacceptable conclusion. The investment of suffering, of blood, and of time had been too great. If it was not here, logic dictated, at least the fevered logic of the explorer, that it must be elsewhere. It must be further. It must be deeper. The gaze of the empire turned east. To understand this shift, we must visualize the geography of South America as it was understood, or rather misunderstood, in the mid-16th century. The Spanish were perched on the spine of the continent, the Andes Mountains. To the west lay the Pacific Ocean, which they knew. To the north lay the Caribbean, which they knew. But to the east lay a void. Standing on the eastern ridges of the Andes, looking down, one sees the world drop away. The mountains do not gently roll down to the sea, they plummet into a sea of clouds. Below those clouds lies the Amazon basin, a green ocean of trees larger than Europe, a place of suffocating heat, massive rivers, and unknown tribes. It was a blank space on the parchment, a terra incognita, and in the cartography of the time, white space was never left empty. It was filled with monsters, with miracles, and with cities. The myth of El Dorado began to migrate. It slid down the mountainside and dissolved into the jungle. The story transformed. It was no longer about El Indio Dorado, the man coated in gold dust at Lake Guatavita. That story was too small, too specific, and now too disproven. The legend molted and grew wings. It became the legend of Manoa. Manoa was not a ritual, it was a metropolis. The whispers that came up from the hot valleys, twisted by translation and amplified by greed, spoke of a civilization that had fled the Inca conquest years prior. It was said that a younger brother of the Inca emperor had taken the vast treasury of Peru and marched east, disappearing into the jungle to found a new secret empire that was even wealthier than the one Pizarro had destroyed. In this new version of the dream, the city sat on the shores of a lake that was not a small volcanic crater like Guatavita, but a vast inland sea. They named this lake Parim. Lake Parim became a fixture of the imagination. On the maps drawn in London, Lisbon, and Seville over the next century, this lake would appear as a massive, rectangular, or oval body of water sitting squarely in the centre of the Amazon-Orinoco basin. It was a geographical hallucination. It did not exist. There is no great inland sea in the Guyana Shield. There are floodplains, yes, creating seasonal wetlands that mirror the sky, but there is no Lake Parim. Yet, for 200 years, it was as real to the explorers as the Atlantic Ocean. It was real because they needed it to be. This is the psychology of the search. We often think of the conquistadors as hard, practical men, driven by cold calculation. But in truth, they were the most romantic of dreamers, suffering from a collective delusion. The greed-induced hallucination is a powerful force. When you are starving, you smell food where there is none. When you are desperate for gold, you see the glint of metal in every sunbeam hitting a wet leaf. The rumours fed this delusion. Every time an expedition captured an indigenous person from the lowlands, they would ask the same leading questions. Where is the city? Where is the big water? Where is the gold? The indigenous people, terrified and wanting these dangerous men to leave, would point away. Not here, they would say, further down the river. The people down there, they have what you want. The Spanish interpreted this as confirmation. They didn't hear, go away. They heard, it is just over the horizon. And so the city of gold shifted its location. It was always moving. It was a phantom that retreated exactly as fast as the explorers advanced. If they marched 10 miles, the city moved 10 miles. It existed in the beyond, in the haze of the distance. The atmosphere of the search changed from a military conquest to a mythical quest. The maps of the time reflect this blurring of reality. The rigid coastlines are drawn with precision, detailing every bay and inlet. But the interior is awash of artistic license. Strange beasts are drawn in the margins. Headless men with faces in their chests, giant snakes, and golden towers. The silence of the Andes was replaced by the whispers of the jungle. The wind no longer carried the sound of gold chimes. It carried the scent of humidity and decay. The explorers stood on the precipice of the mountains, looking into the green abyss, and they did not see a wilderness. They saw a vault waiting to be opened. They convinced themselves that the difficulty of the terrain was proof of the prize. God, they reasoned, would not hide something worthless behind such a formidable barrier. The harder it was to reach, the more valuable it must be. The myth had become a parasite, burrowing into the minds of men, urging them to leave the safety of the known world and step off the edge of the map. And the first man to truly throw himself into this new green void was a man who bore the most famous name in the New World. The year is 1541. The place is Quito, a city perched high in the Andes of what is now Ecuador. The air is thin and cold, ringing with the sound of church bells and the clatter of horses' hooves on cobblestones. The man of the hour is Gonzalo Pizarro. Gonzalo was the younger brother of Francisco Pizarro, the conqueror of the Incas. He had grown up in the shadow of his brother's colossal fame. Francisco had toppled an empire. Gonzalo wanted to find a world. He was young, brash, and possessed of a reckless energy that bordered on madness. He had been made the governor of Quito, but administration bored him. He did not want to sit behind a desk and count tax receipts. He wanted the glory of the unknown. And the rumours in Quito were intoxicating. They spoke not only of El Dorado, which was now firmly believed to be in the east, but of another treasure, one that was, in some ways, even more valuable than gold, La Canela, the land of cinnamon. In the 16th century, spices were the oil of the global economy. Cinnamon, cloves, and pepper were worth their weight in silver. They were the preservatives of food, the medicines of the wealthy, and the ultimate status symbols in Europe. A rumour had reached Quito that vast forests of cinnamon trees grew on the eastern slopes of the Andes. If Gonzalo could find them, he would control the spice trade. He would be richer than his brother. Driven by this dual dream, gold and spice, Pizarro organised an expedition that was staggering in its scale. It was less of an exploration party and more of a mobile city, a migration of biblical proportions designed to brute force its way through nature. Picture the departure from Quito. It was a spectacle of arrogance and power. Pizarro assembled over 200 armoured Spanish cavalry and soldiers, but they were the minority. Behind them marched 4,000 indigenous people, enslaved and pressed into service as porters. They carried the supplies, the tents, the weapons, and the food, and the animals. The expedition included a massive herd of livestock to feed the army, over 2,000 pigs, trotting and squealing in the mountain air. There were thousands of hunting dogs, mastiffs trained for war, straining at their leashes. There were herds of llamas carrying baggage. The columns stretched for miles. It was a snake of iron and flesh winding its way out of the city, cheered on by the populace. They believed they were marching toward a paradise of fragrance and gold. They did not know they were marching into a grinder. The first obstacle was the Andes themselves. To get to the east, they had to go up before they could go down. They marched toward the Antisana volcano. The transition of the environment was brutal. They left the eternal spring of Quito and ascended into the Paramo. The temperature plummeted. Icy winds whipped off the glaciers, tearing through the thin cotton tunics of the indigenous porters. The rain turned to sleet and then to snow. In the high passes, the air is so thin that every step feels like running a mile. Men began to freeze. The pigs huddled together for warmth, their squeals silenced by the howling wind. The expedition began to shed lives before it even reached the jungle. Hundreds of the indigenous porters died in the freezing cold, their bodies left by the side of the trail, quickly covered by the drifting snow. Pizarro, wrapped in wool and armour, pressed on. He was indifferent to the loss. In his mind, these were just resources, fuel to be burned to reach the prize. Then came the descent. If the ascent was a trial by ice, the descent was a trial by gravity and mud. The eastern slopes of the Andes are not a gentle ramp. They are a chaotic tumble of cliffs, ravines, and waterfalls. The expedition had to slide down muddy tracks that were little more than goat paths. The horses stumbled and broke their legs. The pigs scattered, and as they dropped in altitude, the air changed. The dry, sharp cold was replaced by a heavy, wet warmth. They were entering the cloud forest. The vegetation exploded. Trees were covered in moss, orchids, and bromeliads. The ground became a sponge. Finally, they reached the basin, the Coca River. They had arrived in the gateway of the Amazon. The contrast was shocking. The men were still wearing their padded armour and steel helmets, designed for battle on the open plains or in Europe. Now they were encased in metal ovens. The heat of the Amazon is not just a temperature, it is a weight. It presses against the skin. It makes the air feel solid. And the land of cinnamon? They found it, but it was a cruel joke. They found wild cinnamon trees, yes, Ishpingo, but they were not the neat, cultivated orchards of their imagination. The trees were scattered thinly through the dense jungle, miles apart. They were huge, hard to harvest, and the quality of the spice was poor, acrid and bitter compared to the true cinnamon of Ceylon. There was no forest of wealth. There was just the jungle. Pizarro was furious. He felt cheated by the landscape. He took out his rage on the local tribes they encountered. When they couldn't produce the gold or the spice in the quantities he wanted, he tortured them. He burned them. He threw them to the war dogs. But the jungle is indifferent to human rage. It does not care about cruelty or ambition. It simply exists, vast and consuming. The expedition pushed forward, following the Coca River, hoping it would lead to El Dorado. But the jungle began to fight back. The path disappeared. In fact, there never was a path. The soldiers had to hack their way through the undergrowth with machetes, inch by inch. The wall of green is a psychological barrier as much as a physical one. In the Amazon, you cannot see the horizon. You cannot see the sun, only the filtered light coming through the canopy. You are trapped in a perpetual twilight. The sense of direction vanishes. And then the rain began. The Amazonian rain is relentless. It rotted their clothes. It rusted their mail. It turned their boots into mouldy prisons for their feet. The river rose, flooding the banks, forcing them to march through waist-deep swamps. The scale of the expedition, once their pride, became their curse. How do you feed 4,000 people and 2,000 pigs in a swamp? The food ran out. The pigs were slaughtered and eaten, but the meat spoiled quickly in the heat. The dogs were eaten next. Then the leather of the saddles. Disease swept through the camp. Fevers, dysentery, and fungal infections. The indigenous porters, who were from the high, cold mountains, had no immunity to the tropical diseases of the lowlands. They died in the thousands. The snake of the expedition was leaving a trail of bones. Pizarro's arrogance began to crack. He was no longer a conqueror marching to glory. He was a desperate man leading a death march. The land of cinnamon was a lie. But El Dorado, surely El Dorado was still ahead. They reached a point where they could march no further. The dense forest and the swamps made movement on foot impossible. The river was their only hope. Pizarro made a decision. They would build a boat. It was an act of desperation. These were soldiers, not shipwrights. They had no nails, no pitch, no seasoned timber. But necessity is a harsh master. They cut down green trees. They set up forges in the mud, melting down the horseshoes of the dead horses to make nails. They used their own torn shirts for caulking. They boiled resin from the trees to seal the wood. They built a brigantine, a clumsy, heavy barge, and named it the San Pedro. It was too small to carry everyone. It was designed to carry the sick, the remaining supplies, and the heavy equipment, while the rest of the army walked along the bank. But as they moved downriver, the rumours of a great city persisted. The indigenous guides, perhaps sensing Pizarro's desperation, told him of a rich land further down, at the confluence of the rivers. They spoke of food, of gold, of people. Pizarro, starving and stalled, called upon his second-in-command, a one-eyed man named Francisco de Orellana. He ordered Orellana to take the boat and 57 men. His mission was to scout ahead, find food, and return. It seemed like a sound plan. Orellana would go downriver, find the city, loot the food, and bring it back to the starving main body. But the river had other plans. As Orellana's boat pushed off into the current, drifting away from Pizarro and the haggard survivors on the bank, a shift occurred. The current of the Coca River, swollen by the rains, was faster than they expected. The boat was swept away, moving at speed. Pizarro watched the boat disappear around a bend in the river. He did not know it then, but he would never see Orellana again. He did not know that he was watching the beginning of one of the greatest betrayals, or perhaps one of the greatest necessities in the history of exploration. The expedition was severed. Pizarro was left behind in the green hell, waiting for a relief that would never come. Orellana was speeding toward the unknown, toward the great river, toward the Atlantic. The atmosphere of this moment is heavy with impending doom. The jungle closes in around Pizarro. The silence returns, broken only by the buzzing of the flies. The ambition of the land of cinnamon had dissolved into mud. The pigs were gone. The horses were dead. The gold was a phantom. And the river flowed on, dark and brown, carrying the dreams of the conquerors away to the sea, indifferent to their suffering, indifferent to their maps, indifferent to their gold. The city of gold had shifted again, pulling away from them, luring them deeper into the darkness. As we leave Pizarro standing in the mud, staring at the empty river, we can feel the weight of the Amazon. It is a place where human ego is compost. It is a place that eats empires. And yet, the story continues, flowing downstream with the current, into the heart of the greatest mystery of all. For Orellana was about to drift not just down a river, but into a legend that would give the river its name. The river was the only thing that made sense. In a world of tangled roots, impenetrable green walls, and suffocating humidity, the river was the only clear line, the only direction that offered movement, but it was a movement that came with a terrible price. The separation of Francisco de Orellana from the main expedition of Gonzalo Pizarro was not a sudden, dramatic mutiny, at least not in the beginning. It was a drift. It was a slow tearing apart of a single body, driven by the most primal of all human needs, hunger. The camp of Pizarro had become a graveyard of ambition. The thousands of pigs were gone, eaten or lost to the mud. The horses were dying. The men were boiling the leather of their saddles and eating the soles of their boots. In this desperation, the rumour of a village downstream, a place of food, of maize, of life, became the only hope. Orellana, the one-eyed lieutenant, a man of sharp intelligence and quieter demeanour than the brash Pizarro, volunteered to take the brigantine, the San Pedro, and 57 men to find this salvation. They pushed the heavy, rough-hewn boat into the current of the Coca River. It was a clumsy vessel, built of green wood and desperation, caulked with torn rags. As the ropes were cast off, the current took them immediately. The men on the shore, skeletal and watching with hollow eyes, waved them off, expecting to see them return in a week with holds full of grain. They did not know they were waving goodbye forever. The journey downriver began with a deceptive ease. The water gripped the keel of the San Pedro and pulled. They moved faster than a man could run. The trees on the banks blurred into a continuous ribbon of emerald. But as the days passed, the river began to change. It grew wider. It grew stronger. They flowed from the Coca into the Napo, and the water turned from a mountain stream into a muscular, churning giant. When they did not find the village after 3 days, the terrifying reality set in. They could not go back. They tried to turn the boat around, to pole against the current, but the force of the water was absolute. The river was a conveyor belt moving in one direction only, east, toward the unknown. To fight it was to die. To surrender to it was the only option. Orellana and his men were no longer explorers. They were flotsam, debris caught in the liquid arteries of the continent. The psychological weight of this realization was crushing. They were drifting away from their commander, away from their countrymen, and away from the only map they knew. They were drifting off the edge of the world. The hunger that had driven them onto the water followed them. They ate the leather straps of their armour. They ate the glue made from boiled hooves. They lay in the bottom of the boat, staring up at the canopy that arched over the river like the vault of a cathedral, waiting for the end. But the river, in its indifference, provided. They eventually found indigenous villages. They raided them for food, turtles, manioc, fish, and as they ate and regained their strength, the river continued to grow. They entered the mainstream of the Amazon, and the scale of the world shifted. The river was no longer a river, it was a moving sea. The far bank began to recede until it was just a pencil line of grey on the horizon. The sky opened up, vast and towering, filled with clouds that looked like mountains of white wool. The atmosphere on the boat shifted from despair to a strange, hypnotic awe. They were the first Europeans to see this. They were drifting through the lungs of the planet. The sounds of the jungle at night were a symphony of alien noises, the roar of howler monkeys, the splash of massive fish, the shrieking of nightjars. They felt small, insignificant specks floating on the back of a leviathan. It was in this state of dreamlike drifting that they encountered the legend that would name the river. The chronicler of the expedition was a Dominican friar named Gaspar de Carvajal. He sat in the boat, his quill scratching against parchment, recording the journey. His words paint a picture of a world that hovers between reality and mythology. As they drifted deeper into the interior, into lands where the drums of the indigenous tribes beat a constant rhythm along the shore, the conflict escalated. The tribes here were not the frightened, scattered groups of the mountains. They were powerful, organised, and they defended their river with ferocity. It was June of 1542. The expedition approached a settlement that seemed different from the others. The drums here were louder, more urgent. A fleet of canoes put out from the shore to intercept the Spanish brigantine. Arrows began to rain down on the deck, whistling through the humid air. Carvajal describes the battle that followed with a mixture of terror and wonder. He wrote that leading the indigenous warriors were women. They were tall, he said, pale of skin and incredibly strong. They fought completely naked, their long hair braided and wound about their heads. They wielded bows of hard palm wood and fired arrows with such force that they could pierce the Spanish armour. They moved through the battle with a terrifying grace, shouting orders to the men, clubbing those who tried to retreat. To Carvajal, a man steeped in the classical education of Europe, there was only one comparison to be made. These were the Amazons of Greek mythology, the warrior women who lived without men, the daughters of Ares. The battle was chaotic. The air was filled with the smoke of arquebuses and the screams of the wounded. Carvajal himself was shot in the eye with an arrow, a wound that would pain him for the rest of his life. Yet he kept writing. He believed, with the fervour of the devout, that they had stumbled upon a kingdom of women warriors, a matriarchy that ruled the heart of the jungle. Was this real, or was it the hallucination of starving, terrified men? Perhaps they saw indigenous men with long hair and no beards, and in the heat of battle their minds superimposed the ancient myths of Greece onto the reality of the Amazon. Perhaps there were women fighting alongside the men, defending their homes with equal ferocity. Or perhaps deep in that unmapped century there really was a tribe where women held the bow and the power. We will never know. The river has washed away the truth, but the name stuck. The river of Orellana became the river of the Amazons. The myth of the warrior women became inextricably linked with the myth of the gold. The two blended together, the promise of wealth and the promise of danger, the city of gold and the guardians of the stream. The expedition continued to drift, carried by the current for thousands of miles, until the water turned brackish, then salty. They had reached the Atlantic. They had crossed the continent. They had survived the impossible. But they had left Pizarro behind in the green hell, and they had left the mystery of the interior unsolved. They brought back stories of white cities, of gold, and of warrior women, stories that would infect the minds of Europe for generations. While the Spanish were being swallowed by the jungle from the west, a different ambition was stirring in the north. The search for El Dorado was not solely a Spanish enterprise. The heavy, golden shadow of the legend had fallen across the ocean to the banking houses of Germany. The Welser family of Augsburg were the bankers of emperors. They had financed the wars and the elections of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain. In return, the cash-strapped monarch had given them something more valuable than land. He had given them a province. He granted them the rights to Venezuela. The German search for El Dorado was different in tone and texture. It did not start in the high peaks of the Andes or the deep rainforests of the Amazon basin. It started in the Llanos. Imagine a sea of grass. The Llanos of Venezuela and Colombia are a vast, flat plain that stretches to the horizon in every direction. It is a landscape of extremes. In the rainy season, it floods, turning into an inland sea, where the only dry land is the occasional elevated mound. In the dry season, it is a parched, dusty oven, where the wind whips the dry grass into singing waves. Into this vastness marched the Germans. The most famous of these expeditions was led by Philipp von Hutten, a young nobleman who was looking not just for gold, but for the validation of his house. The German expeditions were characterized by a cold, efficient determination. They were not conquering for the church or the crown in the same way the Spanish were. They were conquering for the ledger. They were closing a business deal with the earth. Von Hutten and his men spent years wandering the Llanos. The psychological toll of the plains is different from the jungle. In the jungle, you are claustrophobic, trapped by the walls of trees. In the Llanos, you are exposed. There is nowhere to hide. The sun beats down without mercy. The horizon creates a sense of infinity that can break a man's mind. You walk for days, and the view never changes. It is like walking on a treadmill of grass. They followed rumours of a city called Cuenca. The indigenous people of the plains, perhaps to get rid of them, pointed south and east. The rich people are there, they said, the people of the Omaguas. The Omaguas were a real and powerful people living along the Amazon and its tributaries. They were famous for their flattened foreheads, a mark of beauty achieved by binding the heads of infants, and for their fine cotton clothes and trade networks. To the starving Germans, the descriptions of the Omaguas sounded like El Dorado. Von Hutten marched deep into the territory that is now the borderlands of Colombia and Brazil. The journey was a saga of endurance. They fought jaguars, ate lizards, and drank stagnant water from hoofprints in the mud. But unlike many others, they found something. They reached a ridge overlooking a settlement of the Omaguas. From a distance, in the shimmering heat haze of the tropics, the city looked immense. Von Hutten described streets, temples, and a layout that suggested a massive population. He saw the glint of what he thought was gold. He believed he was looking at the outer edge of the empire of the Gilded Man. The Germans charged. But the Omaguas were not the surprised villagers of the coast. They were a disciplined military force. They met the German cavalry with a barrage of arrows and spears. Von Hutten himself was wounded, struck deeply. The small European force was overwhelmed by the sheer number of defenders. They were forced to retreat. The tragedy of the German expedition lies in this retreat. They did not retreat because the city wasn't there. They retreated because it was. They returned to the coast convinced they had found El Dorado. They had seen it with their own eyes. It was real. It was tangible. They just needed more men, more horses, more powder. But history is cruel to those who almost succeed. By the time von Hutten limped back to the coast of Venezuela, the politics had shifted. The Spanish were tired of the German presence. In a twist of bureaucratic violence, a Spanish rival captured von Hutten and had him beheaded with a rusty machete. The secret of the Omagua city died with him. The German ambition was extinguished in the red dust of the Venezuelan coast. The city, they saw, was likely a large Omagua settlement, prosperous and organised, but the gold was, once again, a projection of their desire. The heat haze had turned thatch into gold, and hope had turned a village into an empire. But the report of von Hutten added another layer to the myth. Now there were witnesses. "I saw it," they said. "It is there." The map was filling up with ghosts. The Amazon River had been traversed, the Andes had been scoured, and the Llanos had been crossed. The negative space where El Dorado could hide was shrinking, and as the space shrank, the madness intensified. The search was no longer an adventure, it was becoming a pathology, and no man embodied this pathology more than Lope de Aguirre. We move now to the year 1560. The golden age of the conquest is fading. The great heroes, Cortes, Pizarro, are dead. The men left are the dregs, the latecomers, the bitter veterans who have seen the wealth of the New World parcelled out to others. The expedition of Pedro de Ursua was supposed to be the final, definitive search for El Dorado and the Omaguas. It launched from Peru, descending the Huallaga River into the Maranon and eventually the Amazon. It was a massive floating city of rafts and canoes, carrying soldiers, women, slaves and livestock. But there was a rot at the heart of this expedition. The humidity of the jungle seemed to seep into the souls of the men, festering into paranoia. And the carrier of this infection was a slight, limping man, with a twisted body and a gaze that unsettled all who met it. Lope de Aguirre. Aguirre was a career soldier, but he was also a man who had been broken by the New World. He had marched thousands of miles, fought in the civil wars of Peru, and had nothing to show for it but scars. He hated the polished officers like Ursua, who brought his mistress on the expedition and treated the journey like a royal procession. Aguirre saw the jungle not as a place of wonder, but as a place of judgment. As the rafts drifted deeper into the Amazon, the discipline began to unravel. The heat was oppressive, a wet wool blanket that never lifted. The insects were a torture. The river was endless, a brown serpent that coiled through a landscape of monotony. Aguirre began to whisper. He whispered in the ears of the soldiers that Ursua was a fool. He whispered that El Dorado was a lie, a trick by the viceroy to get the veterans out of Peru so they wouldn't cause trouble. He whispered that the only real power was the power they took for themselves. On New Year's Day, 1561, the whispers turned to knives. Aguirre and his conspirators surrounded Ursua's hut and hacked him to death. With the commander dead, the expedition descended into pure madness. Aguirre took control, but he did not turn back. He did not continue the search for gold. He declared war on the world. In the heart of the Amazon, thousands of miles from any court or king, Aguirre drafted a letter to King Philip II of Spain. It is one of the most chilling documents in history. He declared his independence. He renounced his allegiance to Spain. He signed it, Lope de Aguirre, the wanderer, the traitor. He called himself the wrath of God, Prince of Freedom. The search for El Dorado had ceased to be about gold. It had become a vehicle for one man's insanity. Aguirre transformed the expedition into a floating kingdom of terror. He executed anyone who looked at him wrong. He murdered the priests. He murdered the women. He murdered his own friends. He was purging the weakness from the world, leaving only the pure, hard core of hatred. The rafts drifted down the Amazon, leaving a trail of blood in the water. The jungle, which had defeated so many with its indifference, was now witnessing a human evil that rivaled its own cruelty. The birds fell silent as the Maranones, the men of the Maranon River, passed by. Aguirre's plan was suicidal. He intended to sail out of the Amazon, swing north, conquer Panama, and then invade Peru to seize the empire for himself. It was a fever dream, born of the syphilis and the heat that ravaged his brain. He did make it out of the Amazon. He reached the island of Margarita and eventually the mainland of Venezuela, burning and killing as he went. But the Spanish forces closed in. His men, terrified of his madness, began to desert him. The final scene of Aguirre's life is the darkest stain on the El Dorado legend. Surrounded in a fortress in Barquisimeto, knowing the end was near, he went to the room where his teenage daughter, Elvira, was waiting. She had travelled with him through the entire nightmare. She was the only thing he loved. He looked at her and said, "Commend yourself to God, my daughter, for I am about to kill you." He reasoned that he could not let her live to be bedded by his enemies, to be the daughter of a traitor. In a final twisted act of possession, he stabbed her to death. Moments later, his own men shot him. As the bullet struck him, he is said to have leaned against the wall and muttered, "This is nothing, this is nothing." When the final shot hit his heart, he said, "Ah, traidores!" Ah, traitors! His body was quartered and displayed on the roads. His head was placed in a cage. The madness of Lope de Aguirre marked the end of an era. The search for El Dorado had started as a ritual of the sun, a ceremony of light and water. It had transformed into a dream of a golden city, but in the hands of Aguirre, it had become a nightmare of blood and shadow. The gold had been stripped away, leaving only the raw, exposed nerves of the human psyche. The Amazon flowed on, indifferent to the tragedy. It washed the blood from the rafts and swallowed the bones of the dead. The silence returned to the river, but it was a heavier silence now. The ghosts of the expedition lingered in the mists. The murdered commander, the warrior women, the starving Germans, and the madman who declared war on God. The legend of El Dorado was wounded, but it was not dead. The horror of Aguirre's journey did not stop the dreamers. It only made them pause. The map still had blank spaces. The Lake of Parimé was still drawn in blue ink in the centre of the jungle, and as long as there was a blank space, there would be men willing to walk into it. The next chapter would belong not to the Spanish, but to a poet, a courtier, and a knight from a foggy island in the north who sought to redeem his honour in the golden light of the tropics. Sir Walter Raleigh was waiting in the wings. But before we turn to him, let us rest for a moment on the banks of the great river. Listen to the water lapping against the mud. Hear the distant cry of the macaw. The air is heavy and warm. The history here is soaked into the soil, a history of longing and loss. The river moves slowly, endlessly, carrying the memory of the search down to the sea, washing it clean, preparing the way for the next dreamer to arrive. While the Amazon swallowed the madmen and the dreamers in the east, the silence of the high Andes remained unbroken. The wind continued to weave through the Frailer Jones plants, and the mist continued to roll over the dark, unblinking eye of Lake Guatavita. The rituals had stopped long ago. The fires of the priests were cold ash. The golden man was a memory fading into the geology of the mountains. But memories, especially those made of gold, have a way of haunting the present. By the year 1580, the frantic armoured rush of the conquest had settled into the slow, bureaucratic grind of colonisation. The city of Bogotá was growing, a place of stone churches and tiled roofs. In the markets and the plazas, men no longer spoke of a magical city that moved like a phantom. They spoke of business. And among these practical men was a merchant named Antonio de Sepúlveda. Sepúlveda was a man of the ledger, not the sword. He looked at the legend of El Dorado and saw a mathematical equation. He reasoned that the city of Manoa might be a fiction, a fever dream of the jungle, but the lake was real. The stories of the offerings were consistent. For centuries, the Muisca kings had thrown gold into that water. It wasn't a mythical mine, it was a bank vault, and the water was simply the door that needed to be opened. He did not gather an army to march into the unknown. He gathered a workforce of indigenous labourers and brought them to the rim of the crater. His plan was audacious in its simplicity. He would drain the lake. The atmosphere of this endeavour was not one of adventure, but of industry. Imagine the sound of it. The high, thin air of the Paramo, usually so quiet, was filled with the rhythmic strike of iron pickaxes against stone. Clink, 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 day after day, month after month. It was the sound of human stubbornness chipping away at the earth. Sepúlveda ordered a massive notch to be cut into the rim of the crater, a V-shaped wound in the side of the mountain, designed to let the water bleed out. It was brutal, muddy, back-breaking work. The rain fell constantly, turning the construction site into a slurry of freezing mud. The workers slipped and struggled, their breath pluming in the cold air, hauling baskets of wet earth up the steep slopes. But it worked. As the cut deepened, the water began to flow. The level of the lake dropped. It receded from the shoreline, revealing the mud that had been hidden for thousands of years. The scene that followed was one of grim fascination. Sepulveda and his overseers waded into the thick, sucking silt of the lake bed. They were not walking on streets of gold. They were walking in the muck of history. And there, glinting in the dark slime, they found it. They pulled out breastplates made of hammered gold, thin and fragile as autumn leaves. They found emeralds the size of walnuts, green stones that had once been prayers. They found the golden tunjals, the small votive figures of snakes and warriors. It was tangible proof. The legend was true. The golden man had been here. Sepulveda recovered thousands of pesos worth of gold. It was a fortune, but it was not the infinite hoard he had imagined. The centre of the lake, the deep heart where the kings had thrown their greatest treasures, remained just out of reach, covered by the remaining water and yards of treacherous silt. And then the mountain fought back. The earth, destabilised by the massive cut and softened by the relentless Andean rain, gave way. With a sound like a low groan of the earth itself, the walls of the cut collapsed. Thousands of tons of rock and mud slid down, burying the excavation, burying the workers who were in the trench, and sealing the wound. The water rose again. The lake reclaimed its secrets. Sepulveda, bankrupt and broken by the tragedy, died without ever reaching the centre. The lake returned to its silence, the scar on its rim slowly healing over with moss and grass, a testament to the fact that some doors are not meant to be opened. The gold remained in the dark, sleeping in the cold embrace of the dragon, untouched by the greed of men. But as the door closed in the Andes, another was opening across the ocean. The fever of El Dorado was contagious, and it travelled on the trade winds to the court of Queen Elizabeth I in England. The year is 1595. The English were late to the New World. They watched with envy as Spanish galleons returned to Europe heavy with silver and gold, fueling the empire of their enemies. England needed its own empire. It needed its own gold. And the man who would take up the mantle of the search was not a rough mercenary, but a knight, a poet, and the most romantic figure of his age, Sir Walter Raleigh. Raleigh was a man of velvet and steel. He was a favourite of the Queen, a courtier who knew the power of words as well as the power of the sword. But he had fallen from grace. He had married one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting without permission, a scandal that landed him in the Tower of London. Desperate to regain his position and his sovereign's love, he needed a miracle. He needed El Dorado. But Raleigh's vision of the Golden City was different. He did not look to the Andes, nor to the deep Amazon where the Spanish were dying. He looked to the coast of Guyana, the wild, mangrove-choked delta of the Orinoco River. He believed the city lay there, protected by the labyrinth of water. Raleigh's expedition was different in tone from the brutal marches of Pizarro or Quesada. Raleigh saw himself as a liberator. He knew the indigenous people hated the Spanish, and he planned to use that hatred to build an alliance. He didn't want to conquer El Dorado. He wanted to be invited in. The atmosphere of Raleigh's journey is one of literary wonder. When he arrived at the mouth of the Orinoco, he was not just a soldier, he was a tourist in paradise. His writings describe a world of overwhelming beauty. He wrote of the birds of all colours, crimson macaws, yellow troupials, toucans with beaks like painted wood, flashing through the trees. He wrote of the great winds that swept through the delta, carrying the scent of strange flowers and spicy barks. He navigated the river not with the desperation of a starving man, but with the curiosity of a scholar. The Orinoco Delta is a maze of islands and waterways, a place where the distinction between land and water blurs. The trees grow directly out of the river, their roots tangling like snakes in the current. The light there is dappled and green, filtering through the high canopy. Raleigh met with an elderly chieftain named Topiawari. They sat together in the shade of the great trees, sharing tobacco and stories. Topiawari told him of a rich people who lived further inland, a people who powdered their bodies with gold. It was the same story, the echo of the Muisca ritual, but to Raleigh it was fresh news. It was the confirmation he needed. He did not find the city. The river rose, the rainy season began, and the waterfalls blocked his path. But he found something else. He found the beauty of the land itself. He fell in love with Guyana. To him the country was a woman, a country that hath yet her maidenhead, untouched and waiting. He saw gold in the stones. He saw wealth in the soil. He saw potential. Raleigh returned to England without a hold full of treasure. He had a few gold samples, some quartz, and a young indigenous man he had brought back. In the eyes of the pragmatic investors, the voyage was a failure. But Raleigh had a weapon that the Spanish conquistadors lacked. He had a printing press. If he could not bring the gold to England, he would bring the dream. In 1596 he published The Discovery of the Large, Rich, and Beautiful Empire of Guyana. It was a masterpiece of propaganda and poetry. Raleigh took the whispers of the jungle and solidified them into facts. He described the city of Manoa in vivid hallucinations detail. He wrote of the Emperor of Guyana, a descendant of the Incas, who presided over a city of such wealth that the kitchen utensils were made of gold. But the most powerful thing Raleigh created was not the text, it was the map. Raleigh and the cartographers he worked with drew a map of South America that would haunt the world for 200 years. In the blank space of the interior, where no European had ever been, they drew a lake. It was not a small lake. It was a massive inland sea, oblong and vast, stretching for hundreds of miles. They labelled it Lake Parim. And on the shores of this fictional sea, they placed the city of Manoa. The map gave the myth a location. It gave it a shape. It is a testament to the power of the human mind to create its own reality. There is no Lake Parim. It does not exist. It likely stemmed from indigenous descriptions of the seasonal flooding of the Rupununi savanna, where the water rises to create a temporary wetland. But on the parchment, in the smell of the ink and the crisp lines of the engraver, it became real. Europe was bewitched. The map hung in the libraries of scholars and the chart rooms of captains. It whispered to them. It said, "Look, it is right there. You just have to sail up the river and cross the lake." The white patch on the map had been filled, not with geography, but with desire. Raleigh had regained some of his fame, but the gold was still theoretical. The years passed. The Queen died. King James I took the throne, a man who despised Raleigh and feared war with Spain. Raleigh was thrown back into the Tower of London, this time for treason. For 13 years the Knight of the Sea sat in a stone cell. He watched the grey rain of London streak the glass. He grew old, his hair turned white, his body stiffened, but the map remained in his mind. The tropical sun of Guyana burned in his memory, a torment and a promise. He spent his time studying chemistry, writing history, and dreaming of the one last chance to redeem his name. In 1617 the chance came. King James, short of money and tempted by the tales of gold, released Raleigh. But it was a release with a terrible condition. Raleigh could go back to Guyana to find the mine, but if he attacked any Spanish settlements, he would be executed upon his return. It was a setup for failure. The Spanish controlled the river. There was no way to go back without conflict. Raleigh accepted the terms. He was 65 years old, a ghost of the man who had laid his cloak before the Queen. He mortgaged everything he owned. He commissioned a ship, the Destiny. He took his son Wat, a fiery young man who wanted to be a hero like his father. The last crusade was a tragedy from the moment the anchors were weighed. The Atlantic crossing was brutal. Storms battered the fleet. Sickness swept through the ships. Raleigh himself fell ill with a terrible fever, leaving him bedridden, shivering and delirious as the coast of Guyana came into view. He could not lead the expedition upriver. He had to stay behind at the river mouth, weak and helpless, while his son Wat and his trusted captain, Keymis, took the boats inland to find the mine. Raleigh lay in his cabin, listening to the water lap against the hull, waiting. The days turned into weeks. He dreamed of the gold, of the vindication, of walking into the king's court with the wealth of an empire. But upriver the dream was dying in a hail of musket fire. Keymis and Wat found no gold mine. Instead, they stumbled upon a Spanish settlement, San Tomé. A skirmish broke out. In the confusion and the smoke, young Wat Raleigh, eager to prove himself, charged the Spanish lines. He was cut down. The news travelled slowly down the river. When Keymis returned to the Destiny, he had to walk into the cabin of the sick old man and tell him the truth. "There is no gold, Sir Walter, and your son is dead." The scene in that cabin is one of the most crushing moments in history. Raleigh, the man of words, had none left. His heart broke. He lashed out at Keymis, blaming him for the boy's death. Keymis, unable to bear the guilt and the shame, went to his own cabin and returned to his creator. Raleigh was alone. The expedition had failed. He had broken the king's order. He had lost his fortune. He had lost his son. The Empire of Guyana was nothing but mangroves and mud. The journey back to England was a funeral procession. The Destiny limped across the ocean, carrying a broken man back to his executioner. Raleigh knew what awaited him. He wrote a letter to his wife, Bess. "My brains are broken. Comforts have flown." When he arrived in London, the sky was the colour of iron. He was arrested immediately. The king did not care about the tragedy. He cared about the politics. Raleigh was sentenced to death. On the morning of October the 29th, 1618, Sir Walter Raleigh was led to the scaffold in the Old Palace Yard at Westminster. The crowd was silent. They were watching the death of an era. The Elizabethan age of adventure, of poetry, of the golden dream was ending. Raleigh dressed for the occasion in black velvet. He was calm, possessing a dignity that silenced his enemies. He asked to see the axe. He ran his thumb along the edge and smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "This is a sharp medicine," he said, "but it is a physician for all diseases and miseries." He laid his head on the block. He did not tremble. The axe fell. And with the death of Raleigh, the great romantic search for El Dorado effectively died. The dream had consumed its most famous lover. It had taken his youth, his freedom, his fortune, his son, and finally his head. The map of Lake Parim would remain on the charts for another century, confusing explorers and geographers, a ghost lake haunting the interior of a continent. But the fever had broken. The world was changing. The age of the knight-errant was over. The age of the scientist was beginning. The atmosphere shifts now. We leave the grey, rain-slicked cobbles of London. We leave the tragedy of the scaffold. The story of El Dorado is a story of heavy costs, of lives traded for a shimmer on the horizon. It is a story of how the human heart projects its desires onto the blank spaces of the world. But the world itself, the physical, breathing world of South America, remained. The jungle grew back over the trails cut by the Germans. The river washed away the ashes of the Spanish fires. The lake in the mountains filled back up with water, hiding its golden secrets under a blanket of cold silence. The true El Dorado was never a city. It was the journey. It was the mist rising off the canopy at dawn. It was the sound of the howler monkeys and the flash of the macaw's wing. It was the vast, unconquerable beauty of a land that refused to be owned. And as we move toward the end of our journey, we must turn our eyes to the man who finally erased the lake from the map. The man who came not to conquer, but to understand. The man who brought the light of reason to the darkness of the myth, Alexander von Humboldt. But for now, let the sadness of Raleigh's end drift away. Let the grey skies clear. Imagine the Orinoco River flowing peacefully to the sea, its waters warm and brown. The birds are settling into the trees for the night. The wind dies down. The ambition of men fades into the quiet rhythm of the earth. The search is a circle. We started in the mountains. We went down to the river. We crossed the ocean. And now we are back, floating in the space between history and dream. The map is blank again. The possibilities are endless. And in the silence of the forest, the golden dust of the imagination settles, soft and heavy, like snow in a tropical land. The story is almost over. The sleepers are safe. The ghosts are at rest. And the city of gold remains where it has always been, in the beautiful, terrible, untouched distance. The transition from the romantic tragedy of Raleigh to the scientific clarity of Humboldt is like waking from a fever dream into the cool light of morning. The monsters in the margins of the map are about to be replaced by measurements. The lake that never was is about to dry up under the gaze of a telescope. But before we wake, let us linger one last moment in the dream. Let us hold the map of Lake Parim in our hands, see the blue ink, see the golden towers of Manoa drawn on the shore. It is a beautiful lie, and sometimes, in the quiet of the night, a beautiful lie is a comfort. It tells us that there is still magic in the world, still mystery, still something waiting to be found. Sleep now in the court of the fairy queen, in the jungles of Guyana, in the high passes of the Andes. The history is a lullaby, a long, winding river of words carrying you to the sea of dreams. The fever broke. It did not happen all at once, but slowly, like a storm front dissipating over the ocean. The collective delirium that had gripped the world for 3 centuries began to lift. The haze of the 16th and 17th centuries, thick with the smoke of gunpowder and the steam of the jungle, gave way to a new kind of light. It was the light of the morning, cool, sharp, and unforgivingly clear. We move now from the age of the sword to the age of the sextant, from the era of the myth to the era of the map. In the year 1799, a young man stood on the deck of a frigate bound for Venezuela. He was not a soldier. He wore no armour. He carried no commission from a king to conquer, and he had no debt to German bankers. His luggage was not filled with empty sacks waiting to be stuffed with gold. It was filled with barometers, thermometers, hygrometers, and cyanometers, instruments to measure the blueness of the sky. His name was Alexander von Humboldt, and he was coming to South America not to take from it, but to see it. Humboldt was a Prussian aristocrat who had turned his back on a life of easy leisure to pursue a different kind of wealth, the wealth of knowledge. He believed that the world was a single, interconnected living organism, a web of life where the stones, the plants, the weather, and the stars were all speaking to each other. He wanted to learn their language. He was the first true scientist of the continent, a man whose curiosity was so boundless that it would rewrite the understanding of the planet. When Humboldt and his companion, the botanist Aimé Bonpland, stepped off the ship in Cumana, the atmosphere of the story shifted. The heavy, oppressive dread of the conquistadors vanished. In its place came a sense of wonder, of fresh air, of intellectual exhilaration. Humboldt looked at the jungle and did not see a green hell or a barrier hiding a city. He saw a cathedral of biology. He saw the intricate relationships between the humidity and the moss, between the river flow and the tree roots. He travelled deep into the interior, following the routes that had killed so many before him. He paddled up the Orinoco River, moving through the sweltering heat with a notebook in his hand, sketching the leaves, measuring the temperature of the water, and tasting the air. He was driven by a desire to fill in the blank spaces of the map, not with dragons or golden towers, but with truth. For 2 centuries, the map of South America had been dominated by a lie. Right there in the centre, between the Orinoco and the Amazon, sat the massive oblong shape of Lake Parim. It was drawn in blue ink, confident assertion that a great inland sea existed. And on the shores of this lake, cartographers had faithfully written the words Manoa or El Dorado. It was a geographical ghost, a phantom limb that the world refused to amputate. Humboldt was determined to find the source of this error. He did not march with an army. He moved with a small team, speaking with the indigenous peoples he encountered. But the questions had changed. He did not ask, "Where is the gold?" He asked, "How does the water flow?" He listened to the geography, not the greed. He travelled to the region where the lake was supposed to be. He explored the vast savannas of the Rupununi, and there, standing in the high grass, looking out over the plains, the answer revealed itself to him. It was a moment of quiet, scientific epiphany. There was no lake. What existed instead was a seasonal miracle. Humboldt realized that during the rainy season, the rivers would swell and overflow their banks, flooding the vast flat plains of the savannah. For a few months of the year, the land did indeed turn into a shimmering sheet of water, stretching for miles, reflecting the sun and the sky. Indigenous villages, built on raised mounds or islands in the plain, would appear to be floating on a great sea. When the waters receded in the dry season, the lake evaporated, leaving behind only mud and grass. The White Sea of Parim was a misunderstanding of the seasons. The City of Gold was a village reflecting in the floodwaters. The myth was born from the sunlight hitting the water and the desire of starving men to see a destination. Humboldt's discovery was not tragic, it was cleansing. He mapped the Casiquiare Canal, a natural waterway that connects the Orinoco and Amazon river systems, proving that the geography was far more complex and beautiful than a simple imaginary lake. He wrote his findings with precision and elegance. He dismantled the myth of El Dorado brick by brick, not with malice, but with the gentle, irresistible force of reality. When he returned to Europe, he brought back the news. The map was wrong. The lake was gone. The city was a dream. In the libraries of Paris and Berlin, the cartographers took out their erasers. The white patch on the map was scrubbed clean. The blue oval of Lake Parim, which had taunted Raleigh and devoured thousands of lives, vanished from the parchment. In its place, the true veins of the continent were drawn, the twisting, turning rivers, the mountain ranges, the dense, continuous carpet of the rainforest. The era of El Dorado ended not with a bang, but with the scratch of a pen. The atmosphere of this moment is one of profound peace. It is the feeling of waking up from a long, feverish nightmare and drinking a glass of cold, clear water. The hallucinations of the past, the headless men, the warrior women, the gilded king, retreated into the realm of folklore. The world was no longer a stage for European fantasies. It was a physical place, governed by natural laws, indifferent to human ambition, and breathtakingly beautiful in its own right. Humboldt showed the world that the mystery of South America did not need to be invented. The reality was enough. The electric eels that could stun a horse, the volcanoes that pierced the clouds, the thousands of species of orchids, the jaguars, the monkeys, the sheer, overwhelming vitality of the continent. This was the treasure. And so we arrive at the end of the search. The maps are finished. The satellites have photographed every inch of the jungle. We know now, with absolute certainty, that there are no golden roofs shining in the sun. There is no king who washes gold from his skin. But as the silence of the library gives way to the silence of the night, we are left with the question: if it was never there, what was it all for? We must look back now, one last time, at the trail of ghosts we have followed. We see the long line of men marching into the green abyss. We see the mud, the rust, the blood, and the madness. We see the tragedy of the indigenous nations, the Muisca, the Omagua, and countless others, who were ground into the earth by the wheels of this obsession. We see the smoke rising from the melted art of Tunja. We see the head of Raleigh falling on the block in London. The cost of El Dorado was incalculable. It was a story written in violence and loss. It serves as a dark mirror to the human soul, showing us the terrifying power of greed and the fragility of our grip on reality. It shows us that we are capable of destroying the world to find a paradise that exists only in our heads. But if we shift our perspective, if we let the heavy, tragic history drift away like smoke, we can see that something remains. The gold was a lie, but the journey was real. The search for El Dorado opened the world. It forced cultures to collide. It mapped the unmapped. It pushed the boundaries of human endurance. And in the end, it taught us a lesson that we are still learning today. The true value of the world is not in what we can extract from it, but in what it is. The real El Dorado was never the metal. It was the forest itself. It was the biodiversity that Humboldt catalogued, the medicine in the bark, the oxygen in the trees, the water that flows through the Amazon, carrying 20% of the world's fresh water to the sea. The gold was the sunlight filtering through the canopy. The emeralds were the leaves. The treasure was the life that thrives in the lungs of the world. And in a philosophical sense, El Dorado is something even more profound. It is the horizon. It is the eternal somewhere else. It is the manifestation of the human need to believe that there is something better, something perfect, waiting just beyond the next ridge. We are a species of seekers. We are defined by our restlessness. We build cities of gold in our minds because the reality of our lives is often too grey, too hard, too finite. El Dorado exists. It exists in the moment you look at a map and wonder what is in the empty spaces. It exists in the feeling of hope that gets you out of bed in the morning. It exists in the dreams that come when you close your eyes. It is not a place you can walk to. It is a place you feel. So let us make peace with the ghosts. Let us forgive the dreamers for their madness, for they were only human, drunk on the possibility of wonder. The frantic searching is over. The shouting of the captains is gone. The clashing of swords has faded into the rustle of the leaves. The jungle has grown back. Imagine it now. Close your eyes and see the trails that Quesada and Pizarro cut through the vines. They are gone. The earth has healed the wounds. The roots of the great kapok trees have broken the stones of the Spanish roads. The moss has covered the armour left in the mud. The flowers bloom over the graves of the conquerors. The forest has reclaimed its own. The silence of the Amazon is not empty, it is full. It is a living silence, vibrating with the hum of insects and the breath of 1 billion leaves. Visualize the sun setting over the Amazon River. The water is wide and calm, a mirror of the sky. As the sun dips below the tree line, the light hits the water at a perfect angle. For a few brief minutes, the river transforms. The brown water turns to liquid fire. It shimmers with a blinding, radiant orange and yellow. The river becomes a ribbon of pure, molten gold, flowing endlessly from the heart of the continent to the sea. There it is. The gilded man is the river. The city of gold is the sunset. It was there all along, happening every single evening for millions of years, asking for nothing, offering everything to anyone who took the time to sit on the bank and watch. The night falls, the gold fades into purple, then into deep velvet blue. The stars come out over the Andes. The Southern Cross hangs low in the sky, the same stars that the Muisca priests watched, the same stars that guided Humboldt. The air cools. The mist rises from the waterfalls, wrapping the mountains in a soft white blanket. The world is at rest. The striving is done. There is nothing left to find, nothing left to conquer. You are safe here, in the quiet aftermath of the history. You are floating on the river of time, drifting slowly, gently, toward the ocean of sleep. The current is warm, the boat is steady. The darkness is a comfort, a soft weight pressing down on your eyelids. Everything that was lost has been found in the quiet of the mind. The gold is within you. The peace is within you. And as the jungle settles into the quiet of the night, and the river flows endlessly to the sea, we leave the city of gold to the realm of dreams. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. Please remember to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Sleep well, my friends.